At my wedding reception, I watched my own sister slip a crushed powder into my champagne glass. I did not panic. I simply waited for her to turn around to flirt with a groomsman, and I switched our glasses. A few moments later, Chantel raised that exact glass for her maid of honor toast. She looked me dead in the eye, took a massive gulp, and smirked. "Congratulations, little sister," she whispered as she hugged me. "My special surprise for you is coming very soon." I smiled back, patting her back gently. "I cannot wait," I told her. 60 minutes later, her surprise arrived, just not for me. The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom cast a golden glow over 300 of the most elite guests in the city. Julian held me close as the band played our first dance. I rested my head against his chest, but my eyes were locked on the head table. Chantel was shifting uncomfortably in her ornate chair. Her designer $5,000 silk bridesmaid dress clung to her tightly, but her face was covered in a thick sheen of cold sweat. She kept gripping the edge of the white linen tablecloth. The heavy dose of industrial laxatives and medical-grade muscle relaxants she had intended for my big moment was finally taking control of her nervous system. She tried to stand up, presumably to make a discreet exit to the restroom, but her legs completely buckled underneath her weight. Julian spun me around the dance floor, and I watched over his broad shoulder as the golden child of our family lost her footing entirely. Chantel stumbled forward and crashed right into the center of the dance floor, interrupting our spotlight. The live music screeched to a sudden and uncomfortable halt. A collective gasp rippled through the massive crowd of high society investors, corporate partners, and extended family members. Chantel grabbed her stomach, letting out a loud, agonizing groan that echoed through the microphone of the wedding singer. She tried to push herself up, but the muscle relaxants had completely paralyzed her lower body control. Right there under the brilliant lights and the gaze of hundreds of horrified guests, the inevitable and deeply humiliating disaster happened. A dark, foul stain rapidly spread across the back of her expensive, pale pink silk dress. The horrific smell hit the front row of tables almost instantly, causing immediate chaos. People covered their mouths, recoiling in absolute pure disgust. Several wealthy guests pushed their heavy wooden chairs back and stood up quickly to get away from the spreading mess. Chantel was sobbing hysterically on the floor, unable to stop what her body was doing, clutching the ruined fabric of her gown. It was the ultimate humiliation broadcast live to the very audience she had spent her entire life trying to impress and manipulate. "My mother!" Darlene shrieked and sprinted across the polished ballroom floor. She threw herself onto the ground, next to her precious daughter, desperately trying to cover Chantel with a cloth napkin. Then Darlene snapped her head up and locked her furious eyes with mine. She scrambled to her feet, marched straight across the dance floor, and slapped me across the face so hard my ears rang. "What did you do to your sister, you jealous piece of trash?" She screamed, her shrill voice echoing through the completely silent room. "You poisoned her because you could not stand that Preston bought her a diamond necklace for your wedding, did not you?" I did not even touch my stinging cheek. I just looked down at her with absolute disgust and unshakable calm. "I poisoned her," I asked, my voice deadly quiet, but carrying perfectly across the vast ballroom space. "Do you remember when I was 16 years old? I had to learn how to cook my own meals and pay for my own groceries, working late shifts after high school. I had to do that because you were too busy draining my college fund to pay for Chantel to fail out of 4 different beauty pageants. You prioritized her vanity over my basic survival every single day of my life. I learned how to protect myself from the toxic people in this family a very long time ago. I did not buy those pills, and I certainly did not force them down her throat. She brought that poison in her own purse. She poured it into my glass when she thought nobody was looking. I just watched her do it, and let her drink her own nasty medicine." Darlene raised her shaking hand to strike me again, but Julian caught her wrist in a firm vice grip, stepping protectively between us. Before Julian could speak, heavy footsteps stomped aggressively across the wooden floorboards. It was Preston, the wealthy white husband of my golden child sister. He had always treated my family like a convenient charity project, constantly reminding us how much his presence elevated our social standing. Tonight his face was bright purple with unhinged rage. He shoved violently past the terrified waitstaff, grabbed the microphone from its stand, and pointed a rigid finger directly at my own chest. "I am going to see you locked in a federal prison for this, Charmaine," he roared over the sound system, making the speakers squeal. "You just deliberately assaulted my wife and humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in this entire state. I brought my biggest investors to this pathetic wedding to close a massive funding round for my tech company. You ruined my entire corporate network with this sick stunt and cost me millions of dollars in potential backing. You are going to pay for this, and I am taking that old house your grandmother left you to cover every single dime of my lost revenue." I stood perfectly still, listening to his arrogant threats bounce off the ballroom walls. He honestly believed he held all the power. He thought his wealth and his white privilege gave him the right to destroy my future simply because his wife failed to drug me. What Preston did not realize was that I was no longer the helpless little girl my family used to bully. I was a forensic accountant and a silent partner in a ruthless private equity firm. I already knew his entire company was a fragile house of cards. I stared right back at him, feeling a deep sense of anticipation brewing inside my chest. Go ahead and try Preston, I thought to myself. The real game has only just begun for you all. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room waiting area buzzed with a relentless hum that matched the pounding in my head. We had been sitting in the sterile corridor for barely an hour since the ambulance hauled Chantel away from my ruined wedding reception. My mother, Darlene, paced the scuffed linoleum floor with her arms crossed over her chest. Her expensive silk shawl was stained with tears and champagne. She was muttering under her breath about the disgrace and the humiliation, and how the entire city would be talking about her precious daughter by tomorrow morning. I sat calmly on the stiff plastic chair next to Julian. My wedding dress was surprisingly untouched by the disaster that had unfolded on the dance floor. Julian held my hand firmly in his. His thumb rubbed soothing circles against my knuckles. We were completely silent, watching the chaos of my family unfold. The double doors of the treatment area swung open, and a tired-looking doctor holding a clipboard stepped into the hallway. My mother rushed toward him, immediately grabbing his forearm. "Tell me she is going to be all right, doctor," Darlene pleaded, her voice echoing loudly down the quiet hall. "Tell me my baby is not dying from whatever her jealous sister fed her." The doctor gently removed my mother from his arm and took a step back. He looked at his clipboard and then looked at the four of us. "Your daughter is not dying, ma'am," the doctor said with a remarkably flat tone. "She is severely dehydrated and experiencing intense abdominal cramping. We pumped her stomach and ran a toxicology screen. She ingested a massive, and I mean massive, dose of industrial-strength laxatives combined with prescription muscle relaxants. It is a highly dangerous cocktail that caused a complete loss of bowel and motor control." Preston stepped forward. His face was bright red, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his ruined tuxedo collar. He pointed a rigid finger at me. "I told you she was poisoned," he barked at the doctor. "This woman spiked her drink. I want her arrested right now for attempted murder." The doctor let out a long, exhausted breath. "Sir, the substance was not a subtle poison. It was a very specific combination of pills that someone would have to swallow intentionally or mix into their own drink by mistake. If you want to involve the police, that is your right, but right now your wife needs fluids and rest." The doctor turned and walked back through the double doors, leaving the harsh truth hanging in the air. I looked at Preston and tilted my head slightly. "It sounds like your wife made a terrible mistake mixing her own cocktail, Preston," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. Preston marched across the hallway and stood directly over me. His white privilege and arrogant entitlement practically radiated off him. He was used to intimidating people into submission. He thought because he wore a nice suit and threw around startup buzzwords that my family was supposed to worship the ground he walked on. My parents certainly did, but I never bought his act. "You listen to me, you arrogant little nobody," Preston hissed. "I do not care what that doctor just said. I know you did this to humiliate us. Do you have any idea who was in that room tonight? I brought 3 of the top venture capitalists in the state to your pathetic little wedding. I was supposed to close a $2 million seed round for my tech company tonight. Those investors walked out of the ballroom laughing. They canceled my meetings for next week. You ruined my reputation, and you ruined my company. I looked up at him without blinking. Your reputation was ruined the second your wife soiled herself in front of 300 people, Preston. That has absolutely nothing to do with me. My father, Vernon, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and stood shoulder to shoulder with Preston. Vernon had always worshipped Preston. He treated this arrogant white man better than he had ever treated his own flesh and blood. Vernon looked at me with pure disgust. You are going to fix this, Maya, my father demanded, his voice shaking with anger. You owe your brother-in-law for the damages you caused tonight. Preston lost investors because of this family embarrassing him, and you are going to make him whole. Preston needs $100,000 in liquid capital by Monday morning to keep his company afloat, and you are going to get it for him. I let out a short, dry laugh. You want me to hand over $100,000 for a ruined networking event at my own wedding? I do not have that kind of cash sitting in a shoebox, Vernon. My father sneered at me, crossing his arms over his chest. Do not play stupid with me, Maya. You have Big Mama's house. Your grandmother left that property solely to you, and it is completely paid off. It is just sitting there in a gentrifying neighborhood gathering dust while you play house. You are going to go to the bank on Monday morning and take out a home equity loan against that property. You will give that money to Preston so he can save his business. The sheer audacity of his demand sent a cold thrill straight through my veins. They wanted me to leverage the only piece of generational wealth my grandmother had secured just to bail out a lying fraud. Big Mama left that house to me because she knew I was the only one in this family who would not sell our history to buy a designer handbag, I said, keeping my tone dangerously soft. I am not touching that house. You do not even need it, Preston scoffed, looking down at me as if I were a piece of dirt on his expensive shoes. You are just a glorified calculator, Maya. You sit in a cubicle all day crunching numbers for other people. You have zero ambition. I am a visionary. I am building a tech empire that will elevate this entire family to the next tax bracket. You are holding us back out of pure spite. Family sacrifices for each other, but you have always been a selfish brat. My mother chimed in, wiping her fake tears. She has never supported us, Preston. We paid for Chantel to go to the best schools and have the best opportunities, but Maya always resented it. She is just an accountant. She does not understand how real business works. They truly believed their own lies. They had no idea that my glorified calculator job was actually a cover for my role as a senior forensic accountant and a silent partner at a ruthless private equity firm. I dismantled companies twice the size of Preston's failing startup before my morning coffee. I knew exactly how real business worked, and I knew exactly how to destroy him. I am not signing a single document, I told my father, looking him dead in the eye. And I am certainly not paying a dime to this arrogant fool. Preston lunged forward, closing the distance between us. His face was twisted in an ugly mask of pure rage. You will pay me, Maya, he threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. Or I will bring down a legal team so massive you will be paying my attorney fees for the rest of your miserable life. I will take everything you own. Julian stood up from the plastic chair. He moved with the smooth, calculated grace of a seasoned corporate attorney. He stepped squarely between Preston and me, forcing the larger man to take a step back. Julian casually adjusted his suit jacket and pulled his smartphone from his inner pocket. We aren't paying a single dime, Julian said, his voice dripping with absolute authority. You can call whatever legal team you want, Preston, but I suggest you watch this first. Julian tapped the screen and held the phone up for Preston, Vernon, and Darlene to see. In fact, Julian continued smoothly. Maya recorded Chantel tampering with the drinks right before the toast. The video started playing on the bright screen. It clearly showed Chantel standing by the head table, reaching into her designer clutch and emptying a handful of crushed white powder directly into my champagne glass. It was indisputable high-definition proof of her crime. The hallway went dead silent as my family stared at the glowing screen, watching their golden child seal her own fate. The hallway went dead silent as my family stared at the glowing screen, watching their golden child seal her own fate. The arrogant sneer melted off Preston's face, replaced instantly by a pale, sickly shade of panic. He took a stumbling step back, running his hands over his perfectly styled hair. My mother, Darlene, let out a strangled gasp and instinctively reached out, trying to snatch the phone from Julian. Julian simply stepped back, slipping the device safely into his tailored jacket pocket. The sudden shift in the air was palpable. Just seconds ago, they were ready to crucify me, to strip me of the only property I owned, just to satisfy the ego of a man who looked down on all of us. Now they were trapped. My father, Vernon, cleared his throat, the harsh, aggressive tone completely vanishing from his voice. "Now, Maya, let us not be hasty here," he stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "We are all family. There is no need to involve the police in family business." Family business. I repeated the words, tasting bitter on my tongue. "You literally just threatened to sue me and take my grandmother's house over a medical emergency that your precious daughter caused herself. You called me a glorified calculator 5 minutes ago. Now suddenly we are family." Darlene started to cry. It was her signature move whenever her golden child faced actual consequences. "Maya, please, you cannot show that video to the authorities," she begged, tears ruining her expensive wedding makeup. "If Chantel gets arrested for tampering with drinks, Preston's investors will pull their funding immediately. His entire company relies on his pristine public image. A criminal investigation would destroy everything he has built. You would not do that to your own sister, would you?" I looked at my mother, feeling nothing but an icy detachment. I remembered being 19 years old, begging her to help me cover my final semester of tuition. She told me she did not have a single dollar to spare. A week later, she co-signed a massive loan so Chantel could launch a luxury skincare line that failed in 6 months. I remembered the exact look on her face when she told me I needed to learn how to struggle. I looked at her now, begging for mercy to protect a white man's tech startup and a sister who literally tried to drug me on my wedding day. "I do not care about his public image, Darlene," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. "And I certainly do not care about his investors. What I care about is my grandmother's house. You want this video gone. You want to pretend this entire embarrassing night was just a tragic medical fluke. Fine. But you leave Big Mama's property alone. You do not ask for a loan against it. You do not ask me to leverage my assets to pay for Preston's ruined networking event. You never mention that house to me again." Preston swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically down the hospital corridor, as if expecting the police to march through the double doors at any second. "Okay," he said quickly, his voice tight. "Okay, we leave the house alone. We cover the hospital bills and we act like this never happened. Just delete the video, Maya. Swear to me you will delete the video right now." I looked at Julian, who gave me a subtle nod. I pulled out my own phone, opened the gallery, and tapped the delete icon on the file Julian had forwarded to me. "It is gone." I lied smoothly, knowing Julian had the original backed up on a secure, encrypted cloud server. "But if you ever try to come for my property again, I will somehow miraculously recover it and send it directly to the local news stations. Are we clear?" My parents nodded furiously, their relief so obvious it was pathetic. Vernon actually reached out to pat my shoulder, but I stepped away before he could make contact. I turned my back on them, linking my arm through Julian's. "Let us go," I told my husband. "We have a honeymoon suite waiting, and I am done looking at these people." We walked down the long, sterile hospital corridor, the sound of my wedding heels clicking against the linoleum echoing in the quiet space. Just as we reached the corner, turning toward the elevator bank, the clasp on my beaded evening clutch suddenly gave way. It hit the ground, spilling my lipstick, a compact mirror, and my car keys across the floor. Julian knelt immediately to help me gather my things. We were perfectly hidden around the corner, completely out of sight from where my family stood outside Chantel's hospital room. As I reached for my keys, the sound of Preston's voice drifted down the hallway. He was no longer whispering in a panicked tone. His voice was sharp, dripping with his usual entitled malice. "Let the little accountant feel like she won for tonight," Preston hissed to my father. "It does not matter anyway. The paperwork is already in motion." I froze, my hand hovering over the cold floor. Julian stopped moving his eyes, locking onto mine as we crouched in the shadows. "What are you talking about, Preston?" my father asked, his voice trembling slightly. "She said she deleted the video. We have to leave the house alone." "We are not leaving anything alone," Vernon Preston scoffed, letting out a dark, arrogant chuckle. "My guy at the zoning office already approved the forged signature on the deed transfer last Thursday. She thinks she holds the cards because she deleted a video on her phone, but she does not even own that property anymore. We secured the funding through a private lender using the land as collateral. We bulldozed the old lady's house on Tuesday morning to break ground on the new commercial development. By the time your useless daughter figures out her grandmother's precious house is a pile of rubble, the money will already be cleared into my corporate accounts." I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to pure ice. They had forged my signature. They had illegally transferred the deed to my grandmother's home, the only place I had ever felt safe growing up. The house where Big Mama taught me how to read financial statements at the kitchen table because she knew my parents would never invest in my education. Preston and my own father had conspired to steal it and demolish it just to keep a fraudulent tech company afloat. I heard my mother let out a soft, nervous breath. "Are you sure this will work, Preston? If Maya finds out, she will go to the police." "She will not find out until the bulldozers are already rolling over the porch," Preston replied, his voice laced with supreme confidence. "And even if she does, she is just a mid-level number cruncher. She does not have the resources or the legal power to fight my corporate attorneys. We will bury her in litigation until she gives up. Just keep her distracted until Tuesday." I did not gasp. I did not cry. I did not storm around the corner and confront them with screaming rage. Julian picked up my clutch, placed the items inside, and handed it to me. He looked at my face, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. The quiet, dutiful daughter they had underestimated for 27 years was officially dead. We stood up silently and walked into the elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing us inside the metal box. I did not say a word as we walked through the hospital parking garage toward our car. The cool night air whipped against my face, but I felt nothing but absolute blistering focus. Preston thought I was just a glorified calculator. He thought I was a mid-level employee who would easily bow down to his expensive legal team. He had absolutely no idea that my daily routine involved dismantling corrupt corporations and liquidating assets for shadow lenders. I climbed into the passenger seat of Julian's car. Julian started the engine but did not pull out of the parking space. He simply looked at me, waiting. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out my secure work laptop. I powered it on the screen, casting a harsh blue light over my face in the dark car. I logged into the encrypted portal connecting directly to the central database of my private equity firm. I bypassed the standard firewalls and pulled up the corporate registry for Preston's highly publicized tech startup. "Cancel the honeymoon," I said softly, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Julian put the car in drive, a dangerous smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Where are we starting?" he asked. I pulled up Preston's shadow lender, the exact firm holding the forged collateral on my grandmother's house. "I am going to track every single penny this arrogant fraud has ever spent," I replied. My eyes locked on the scrolling data, and by the time the sun comes up, I am going to bleed him completely dry. Julian drove in total silence as the hospital disappeared in our rearview mirror. Our bags were still packed in the trunk for a 2-week honeymoon in the Maldives, but neither of us mentioned the airport or the pristine beaches we were supposed to be flying to. The moment the tires hit the driveway of our home, I was out of the car before Julian even killed the engine. My heavy wedding gown dragged against the concrete, but I did not care. I walked straight into my home office, locked the door behind me, and kicked off my heels. I pulled up the heavily encrypted software on my terminal. My parents always mocked my accounting degree, calling me a glorified human calculator. They told their country club friends that I just balanced checkbooks for local businesses. They had absolutely no idea what I actually did for a living. I was a senior forensic auditor and a silent partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms in the country. I tracked missing billions for shadow lenders and dismantled fraudulent corporations before breakfast. Finding the truth about Preston and his supposed tech empire was going to be child's play. I ran his company name through our proprietary database, watching the algorithms scrape through offshore accounts, public tax filings, and hidden shell corporations. The loading bar blinked in the dark room, casting a pale blue light across my face. Julian walked in quietly, setting 2 mugs of black coffee on the desk. He stood behind my chair, resting his hands on my bare shoulders as the financial architecture of Preston's entire life spilled out across 3 monitors. It took me exactly 14 minutes to find the rot. Preston was no tech genius. His startup had no viable product, no patents, and 0 actual revenue. The glowing portfolio he constantly bragged about at family dinners was nothing but a classic Ponzi scheme. He was pulling money from new investors just to pay off the early ones, while siphoning hundreds of thousands into his own personal bank accounts to fund Chantel's luxury shopping sprees and their leased sports cars. But the true horror hit me when I tracked the initial seed money that launched his fraudulent enterprise. I followed a complex series of wire transfers from a familiar regional bank straight into Preston's holding company. It was Vernon and Darlene. My parents had completely liquidated their entire retirement fund and handed every last penny over to their golden white son-in-law. They had stripped themselves of their life savings just to finance his delusion of grandeur. They gave him the ultimate financial sacrifice while telling me they could not afford to help me pay for my college textbooks. I felt a bitter laugh escape my throat. They had bought his lies, completely believing he was their ticket to unimaginable wealth, when in reality, he was just a parasite draining them dry. I dug deeper, searching for the specific loan Preston had mentioned in the hospital hallway earlier that night. I bypassed several firewalls to access the internal records of a notorious shadow lender known for high-risk mezzanine debt. When the loan agreement loaded on my screen, my blood ran entirely cold. Preston had secured a $4 million cash injection from this predatory lender, but his worthless startup was not listed as the collateral. The collateral was the deed to Big Mama's property. I pulled up the digital copy of the land transfer document and zoomed in on the bottom line. There was my name carefully traced and forged in blue ink next to a fake notary stamp. My father had to have given Preston my old signature from a discarded college application or a medical form. They actually stole the only piece of genuine history our family had left. Big Mama had worked her fingers to the bone cleaning houses for 40 years to buy that land, and she left it to me because she knew I was the only one who would respect its value. My own father helped a stranger steal it just to save face and keep up the illusion of wealth. The anger that washed over me was not hot or explosive. It was freezing cold and perfectly clear. Julian leaned closer to the screen, tracing the route of the fraudulent loan with his finger. As a corporate attorney, he immediately saw the massive legal trap we could build. "This is federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft," he murmured, his voice deadly calm in the quiet room. "If we call the police right now, they will arrest him, but your parents will immediately hire him a massive defense team. They will drain whatever credit they have left to protect him, because admitting he is a fraud means admitting they lost their retirement and their precious social standing. They will claim you gave them verbal permission to use the house as collateral. They will protect him over their own daughter, just like they always do." Julian was completely right. If we confronted them tonight, Vernon and Darlene would throw themselves on the sword for Preston to avoid the public humiliation of being conned by a white man they worshipped. They would twist the story to the police and blame me for being a vindictive sister. We could not just cut off the head of the snake prematurely. We had to let them build their own cage and walk inside it willingly. "We need them to hang themselves," Julian said quietly, poring over the shadow lender's digital contract. "Preston is desperate for this $4 million to cover his tracks and pay off his angry early investors before they catch on to the scheme. We need to let him think he got away with the forgery so he commits to the crime completely. Once he accepts the loan and moves that stolen money across state lines, the FBI jurisdiction becomes absolute, and your parents will not be able to save him from federal prison." I looked at the name of the shadow lender holding the forged deed to my grandmother's house. They were a mid-level financial firm that my private equity company had been considering acquiring for months. I picked up my secure work phone and dialed my managing partner, waking him up at 3 in the morning. I told him to expedite the acquisition of that firm immediately. I wanted to own that shadow lender's entire debt portfolio by the end of the week. I was going to become Preston's direct creditor. I was going to own every single dollar he owed, and I would personally hold the leash to his federal prison sentence. My partner knew better than to question my instincts and agreed to push the paperwork through immediately. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale gray light through the office blinds. My eyes burned from staring at the screens all night, but I had never felt more awake. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, letting the reality of my ultimate revenge plans settle over me. Preston thought he was untouchable. My parents thought they were securing their golden years. They were all dancing blindly on the edge of a massive cliff, and I was the one holding the safety net they were about to fall right through. My phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating violently against the polished wood. I glanced down at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from my mother, Darlene. I opened it, reading the words that would perfectly set the stage for their absolute destruction. Sunday dinner at our house tomorrow at 6 sharp. She wrote, her tone demanding and entitled even through a digital screen. Preston has a massive announcement about his company and the future of this family. Do not be late, and do not ruin this for us with your jealous attitude. I stared at the glowing text message, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my tired face. They were handing me the perfect opportunity to watch them celebrate their own demise. I typed back a simple response. I would not miss it for the world. The smell of roasted chicken and buttery sweet cornbread filled the wide foyer of my parents' house as Julian and I stepped through the heavy wooden front doors. It was exactly 6:00 on Sunday evening. The air inside the house felt thick and heavy with forced domestic bliss. My mother, Darlene, had outdone herself, setting the massive oak dining room table with her most expensive fine china and polished crystal glassware. She fluttered around the living room, fluffing pillows and acting as if the catastrophic events of my wedding reception had never happened. Vernon sat in his favorite leather armchair, watching a golf tournament on the television with an expression of complete manufactured normalcy. We walked into the living room, and the entire dynamic of the house shifted immediately. Preston stood by the brick fireplace, leaning casually against the mantel as if he owned the entire property. He was swirling a generous pour of aged single malt scotch in a heavy crystal glass. I knew for a fact that the $200 bottle of liquor had been purchased using the very retirement funds he was secretly draining from my parents' bank accounts. Chantel lounged lazily on the plush velvet sofa. She looked absolutely radiant and entirely recovered from her humiliating public disaster just 48 hours prior. Her blonde, highlighted hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a designer silk blouse that probably cost more than my first car. She looked me up and down, taking in my simple black trousers and plain cotton sweater. She let out a loud, dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. I am so glad you could take time out of your cheap little life to join us, Maya. She drawled loudly, making sure everyone in the room could hear her insulting tone. I heard you and Julian canceled your budget honeymoon to the local bed and breakfast. It is such a shame you two cannot afford to travel anywhere exotic, but I suppose that is what happens when you settle for a boring desk job. I poured myself a glass of iced water from a pitcher on the side table and sat down in a chair across from her. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I simply smiled at her. Julian took the seat next to me, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp and observant. He knew exactly what was coming, and he was completely prepared to watch them burn. My mother clapped her hands together, demanding we all move to the dining room for dinner. We took our assigned seats around the massive mahogany table. The spread was excessive, featuring roasted meats, fresh summer vegetables, and an entire basket of warm golden cornbread. Preston sat at the head of the table, a position usually reserved for my father. Vernon did not seem to mind the blatant disrespect. In fact, my father looked at Preston with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. For the first 30 minutes of the meal, the conversation was dominated entirely by Preston bragging about his imaginary tech empire. I listened to his arrogant lies while my mind replayed the events of the past 48 hours. Julian and I had entirely skipped our scheduled flight to the Maldives. Instead, we spent our entire honeymoon locked in my home office, using my private equity firm's proprietary auditing software to track every single penny Preston had ever touched. It took me less than an hour to discover that Preston was not a tech genius at all. He was running a massive illegal Ponzi scheme. He had absolutely no viable product and zero actual revenue. He was simply bleeding my parents' retirement fund dry to pay off his early angry investors. Worse than that, he had used my forged signature to leverage Big Mama's land as collateral for a $4 million illegal loan from a notoriously ruthless shadow lender. Julian had spent the entire weekend preparing the ultimate legal snare. As a brilliant corporate lawyer, my husband knew that confronting my parents immediately would only make them protect Preston. We needed them to hang themselves. We needed Preston to publicly claim the fraudulent assets so he could never back out of the federal crimes he had committed. Preston finished his plate and pushed it away from him. He stood up from his chair and picked up his glass of scotch, holding it high in the air, as if he were giving a toast to a crowded auditorium. "I have an important announcement to make," he declared, his voice booming arrogantly across the dining room. "As you all know, I am on the verge of closing a monumental deal that will secure generational wealth for this family forever. I have decided to graciously absorb Big Mama's old property into my corporate real estate portfolio. That rundown house is an absolute eyesore, and it is sitting on prime commercial land that is doing nothing to elevate our financial standing. I am taking control of the asset to protect the family from Maya's total lack of vision. My team is going to bulldoze that old shack on Tuesday morning and develop a state-of-the-art commercial plaza. I am doing this to pull you all out of mediocrity and ensure your financial futures are permanently secure." Preston looked around the table, waiting for his applause. My parents absolutely beamed with pride, looking at him like he was a conquering hero. Chantel clapped her hands together, leaning over to kiss her husband's cheek. I set my fork down on my plate, the metallic clink echoing sharply in the sudden quiet of the room. I looked directly at my father, ignoring the self-appointed white savior at the head of the table. "Why are you letting an outsider steal our grandmother's legacy?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely conversational. "Big Mama left that house to me because she wanted it to stay in our bloodline. You are letting this man forge legal documents to rip away the only real history we have ever owned." My mother slammed her hands flat against the dining table, making the silverware rattle violently. "How dare you speak to Preston that way?" Darlene screamed, her face twisting with sudden vicious anger. "You are just a jealous, bitter little girl. Preston is a genius and he is saving this family. He graciously gave your father and me a $50,000 dividend payment just last month to prove how successful his company is. He handed us more cash in one day than you will ever see in a decade. Your useless college degree and your pathetic little accounting job could never provide for us the way Preston does. You should be down on your knees thanking him for taking that rotting property off your hands." Vernon chimed in, pointing his finger at me across the table. "You listen to your mother, Maya," he growled aggressively. "You have zero understanding of high-level investments. Preston is a master at creating wealth out of thin air. We are completely financially secure because of him. You are just trying to ruin this dinner because you have always hated your sister, and you cannot stand seeing her married to a real provider who actually knows how to make money." I did not react to their screaming. I did not defend my degree or my career. I did not even glance at Julian, who was sitting perfectly still beside me. I simply reached forward and picked up a piece of warm cornbread from the basket in the center of the table. I took a slow, deliberate bite, chewing the sweet crumb while maintaining direct, unbroken eye contact with Preston. The color was already beginning to drain from his arrogant face as he watched my absolute, unshakable calm. His hand tightened around his Scotch glass, and the smug smile froze completely on his lips. I swallowed my food and dabbed the corners of my mouth with a white linen napkin. I smiled a slow, chilling expression that made the temperature in the dining room plummet. "That is truly amazing, Preston," I said, my voice soft but carrying perfectly across the silent table. "Generating a $50,000 dividend out of thin air is quite the magic trick." Speaking of magical dividends, did you happen to tell my mother and father about the official Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena your little tech company received on Friday afternoon? The dining room fell into a suffocating silence. Preston's face lost every ounce of color, draining from a smug pink to a sickening ash gray. His hand trembled so violently that the ice cubes in his crystal glass clinked loudly against the sides, echoing in the quiet room. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant mask slipped, and I saw the raw terror of a man who knew his entire fraudulent empire was collapsing. But Preston was a practiced con artist, and he recovered with the speed of a desperate cornered animal. He forced a loud, booming laugh that sounded entirely hollow. He slammed his glass onto the table and pointed a shaking finger at me. "You see, this is exactly what I'm talking about, Vernon," he said, his voice rising in an aggressive pitch. "Maya is so incredibly jealous of my white-collar success that she is literally inventing federal investigations just to ruin a family dinner. There is no subpoena. There is no investigation. My startup is a highly regulated, transparent enterprise, and we are on the verge of $1 billion valuation. She cannot stand the fact that a white man came into this family and provided the financial security she was always too lazy to achieve." Chantel gasped dramatically, clutching her chest and looking at me with pure disgust. "You are so pathetic," Maya Chantel whined, adjusting her expensive silk blouse. "You are just furious because Preston is a real man who actually takes care of his wife while you and Julian are stuck living on a basic salary. You cannot stand to see us happy and thriving in high society. You have always wanted to drag me down to your boring, cheap lifestyle, and now you are making up wild lies because Preston is officially taking over that ugly old house." My mother. Darlene stood up so fast, her heavy wooden chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. "How dare you come into my home and spew these toxic lies about your brother-in-law?" she shrieked, her face contorted with absolute fury. "Preston is a visionary, and he has taken care of us while you have done nothing but harbor bitter resentment. You are a miserable liar, Maya. You made up this ridiculous story because you want to destroy the only real happiness your sister has ever known." Vernon slammed his fist onto the table, making the fine china rattle. I sat there perfectly still, letting their misguided rage wash over me. My father leaned across the table, his eyes blazing with a protective anger that he had never once directed toward me in my entire life. "You are an ungrateful child," Vernon spat, his voice dripping with venom. "We gave you everything, and you repay us by trying to tear down the man who is actively saving our retirement. Preston is a financial genius. He handles millions of dollars every single day. You sit in a cubicle playing with spreadsheets, and you think you can understand the complexities of corporate law and venture capital. You are nothing but a liar trying to drag successful people down to your pathetic level." "Get out of my house!" Darlene screamed, pointing a trembling finger toward the grand foyer. "I will not let you sit at my table and disrespect the man who provides for this family. Take your quiet, arrogant husband and leave our property right now. You are no longer welcome here until you are ready to get down on your knees and apologize to Preston for this disgusting slander." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or try to present the digital audit files I had stored on my secure remote server. Julian and I simply stood up from the table in perfect unison. I looked at my mother and father, seeing the absolute blind devotion in their eyes for a man who was actively robbing them blind. They had chosen their side. They had chosen the illusion of elite wealth over their own flesh and blood. I felt a profound sense of closure knowing I owed these people absolutely nothing. My conscience was completely clear. I smiled softly at Preston, who was sweating profusely through his expensive designer shirt. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows. "Have a wonderful evening, Preston," I said, my voice calm and steady. I am sure your top-tier investors will be thrilled to hear about your visionary leadership when the federal agents start knocking on their doors tomorrow morning. Julian placed his hand on the small of my back, guiding me out of the dining room and toward the heavy front doors. My parents were still shouting nasty insults at our backs, calling me bitter and jealous, but their voices faded into meaningless static. The heavy wooden door shut firmly behind us, cutting off their frantic, loud defenses. The cool evening air hit my face, and I took a deep, cleansing breath. The trap had been perfectly laid, and they had eagerly locked themselves inside it. Preston was going to drain my parents' remaining bank accounts tonight to try and cover his tracks before the federal agents arrived, but he had no idea that the money would never be enough to save him. He thought he had outsmarted a simple accountant, but he had just challenged a senior forensic auditor with limitless resources. As soon as we reached Julian's car, I pulled my secure work phone from my coat pocket. I did not even wait to sit down in the passenger seat. I dialed the direct emergency line for the senior acquisitions team at my private equity firm. The call was answered on the first ring by my lead acquisitions director, Mark. He knew that a call from me on a Sunday evening meant a hostile takeover was imminent and extremely lucrative. "Mark, I need you to mobilize the entire overnight acquisition team immediately," I instructed, my voice dropping into the cold, calculated tone of a senior forensic auditor calling the shots. "Execute the buyout of the shadow lender portfolio we discussed on Friday afternoon. Bypass the standard 30-day due diligence period and push the aggressive cash offer we held in reserve. I have verified their internal ledgers, and they are bleeding cash. They are desperate for sudden liquidity, and they will accept the buyout by midnight if we apply enough aggressive pressure to their board of directors. I want all of their active debt contracts completely absorbed into our private holding accounts before the market opens tomorrow." There was a brief pause on the line as Mark processed the magnitude of the directive. I knew exactly what this meant for Preston. By purchasing the shadow lender's portfolio, my firm would become the direct owner of Preston's fraudulent $4 million loan. That meant I would personally hold the forged deed to Big Mama's house as collateral. I would have the absolute legal authority to call in his massive debt immediately, leaving him completely paralyzed and entirely at my mercy. "Do whatever it takes to close the deal tonight," I added, staring at the glowing windows of my parents' house where they were undoubtedly comforting their golden white son-in-law. "I want to own every single cent Preston owes by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." 2 days passed in a state of absolute quiet execution. Mark and my acquisitions team had worked relentlessly through the night, applying massive institutional pressure to the shadow lender's board of directors. By sunrise on Monday morning, the buyout was finalized, and I officially owned every single piece of fraudulent debt Preston had ever signed his name to. I spent the next 48 hours quietly pulling the strings, freezing assets, placing legal holds on his shell companies, and tightening the invisible noose around his entire fake empire. Preston's accounts were locked, his lines of credit were completely suspended, and the artificial wealth he used to buy my parents' blind devotion was entirely vaporized. I was sitting in my home office reviewing the final asset transfer documents when my secure personal phone began to vibrate violently against the polished mahogany desk. An incoming video call request flashed across the screen, displaying Chantel's perfectly curated and heavily filtered profile picture. I accepted the call, leaning back in my leather chair. Chantel's face filled the screen, but she was not calling me for a friendly sisterly chat. She was standing in the middle of a high-end luxury boutique in Beverly Hills, surrounded by rack after rack of designer handbags and imported silk dresses. Behind her, I could see two impeccably dressed sales associates shifting uncomfortably next to a pristine marble checkout counter. Chantel was holding her phone at a high angle, clearly in the middle of one of her pathetic social media live streams, broadcasting her fake luxury lifestyle to thousands of naive followers. But her face was flushed a patchy angry red, and her voice was shrill with absolute panic. The comments on her live feed were scrolling rapidly across the bottom of my screen, filled with confused emojis and people asking why she was screaming at her phone. "What did you do to my bank accounts, Maya?" She shrieked into the microphone, completely ignoring the fact that she was live streaming her own humiliating financial meltdown to the entire world. I just tried to pay for $20,000 worth of designer merchandise, and my exclusive black card declined. They told me the account was frozen. So I tried my platinum card and my joint business account card and my premium travel rewards card, and every single one of them declined right in front of the cashier. The terminal literally said to contact the issuing bank for suspected fraud. I know you did this, you vindictive, jealous little freak. You used your creepy computer systems to hack into my accounts and embarrass me in front of all my followers. Because you cannot stand that I am shopping in Beverly Hills while you are sitting in your depressing little suburban house. I watched her hyperventilate on the screen, the sheer terror of poverty shining clearly in her eyes through the digital feed. She was waving a useless piece of black plastic at the camera, trying desperately to maintain her wealthy persona, while the sales associates politely stepped closer, asking her to please lower her voice or leave the boutique. The irony of her accusing me of financial theft when her own husband had forged my signature to steal our grandmother's land was absolutely rich. It was a stunning display of pure projection. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger or sympathy. I just let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face as I looked at her through the camera lens. I have not touched your bank accounts, Chantel, I replied, my voice perfectly calm and even, echoing through the quiet of my office. There is nothing in your bank accounts worth touching, because you and Preston do not actually have any real money. Everything you own is an illusion built on stolen funds and illegal mezzanine debt. But it is truly hilarious that your very first instinct is to accuse me of financial theft. Do you remember the week before my college midterms 10 years ago? Do you remember when my brand new laptop mysteriously disappeared from my locked dorm room? Chantel froze on the screen, her mouth opening and closing silently as she tried to understand why I was bringing up ancient history during her present crisis. The livestream comments were going wild, asking what I was talking about. I bought that laptop using money I scraped together from working double shifts at a campus coffee shop for an entire year. I continued, keeping my tone completely level so every word landed like a physical blow. You stole it right off my desk and pawned it for a miserable $300 just so you could buy front row tickets to a music festival with your friends. You left me to fail my final exams while you partied out of state. When I told our parents what you did, they called me a liar. They told me I was just being careless for losing my own computer, and they bought your fake tears completely. They bought your lies, then just like they are buying Preston's lies now. I have been entirely financially independent since that exact moment, Chantel. I do not need to hack your pathetic little accounts to ruin your life. You and your fraudulent husband are doing a perfectly fine job of destroying yourselves without any help from me. You are a liar, she screamed, her voice breaking as she realized her followers were hearing every single word. You are just trying to ruin my live stream because you are obsessed with my success. Fix my credit cards right now. Maya or I am calling Dad to tell him you are financially abusing me. I let out a soft, chilling laugh, shaking my head at her absolute total delusion. Call him, I said simply. Call Dad right now and tell him your premium cards declined in Beverly Hills. Tell him to ask Preston why the money suddenly stopped flowing. Enjoy your long walk home, Chantel, because I am absolutely certain your leased sports car is going to be repossessed by the end of the week. Before she could scream another unhinged insult, I reached forward and ended the call, plunging my office back into a deep, satisfying silence. I tossed the phone onto my desk, imagining the sheer horror washing over her as the sales associates finally asked her to leave their luxury boutique empty-handed and humiliated. I turned my attention back to the glow of my monitors, watching the real-time data flowing through our secure auditing servers. The financial freeze was holding perfectly. Preston was entirely locked out of the banking system. The heavy oak door of my office clicked open, and Julian walked in holding a freshly printed legal document. He did not have his usual relaxed posture. His jaw was tight and his eyes were dark with a dangerous, calculated intensity. He walked directly over to my desk and placed the paper down over my keyboard. Preston just panicked. Julian said, his voice low and deadly serious in the quiet room. Your total freeze on his domestic business accounts triggered his flight response exactly like we thought it would. He tried to move cash to pay off his angry early investors, but everything bounced. He realized the shadow lender debt was completely bought out, and he knows the walls are closing in on him fast. But he just made his final fatal mistake. I looked down at the document tracing the highlighted bank routing numbers and offshore wire transfer codes that Julian had just pulled from the financial scrape. What did he do? I asked, already feeling the cold adrenaline spike in my chest. Julian leaned over the desk, pointing directly at the bottom line of the financial trace. Preston just bypassed his frozen corporate accounts and accessed your parents' personal retirement fund. Julian murmured, perfectly calm in the face of their absolute disaster. He just wired $500,000 in clean, untraceable cash straight from Vernon and Darlene's joint account to a hidden offshore account in the Cayman Islands. He is completely draining their life savings and preparing to run before the federal agents show up. I stared at the glowing routing numbers on the computer screen, watching the digital manifestation of my parents' entire life savings vanish into a hidden offshore account. Preston was not just a common fraud, he was an absolute coward. He was actively siphoning every last drop of cash Vernon and Darlene had ever earned preparing to flee the country and leave them entirely destitute. Julian stood beside my leather chair, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder as we watched the massive transaction finalize in real time. Preston was desperately trying to save his own skin while leaving my sister and my parents to take the fall for his massive federal crimes. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for any of them. They had chosen this exact path, willingly blinded by their own pathetic greed and their desperate need to worship a man simply because he wore expensive suits and fed their fragile egos. The heavy silence of my home office was suddenly shattered by a violent pounding at our front door. The loud knocks were frantic and completely unhinged, echoing sharply through the quiet hallways of our house. Julian and I exchanged a sharp, knowing look before I stood up from my desk and walked slowly down the corridor. My bare feet were silent against the hardwood floor as I approached the entryway. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open. Vernon and Darlene stood on my front porch, looking absolutely deranged. They pushed their way past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation or offering a single word of greeting. The contrast between their current panicked state and their usual smug country club perfection was staggering. My mother's normally immaculate blonde hair was flat and disheveled, sticking to her forehead with nervous sweat. She wore a designer cashmere coat thrown haphazardly over a wrinkled silk blouse. My father looked even worse. His face was a pale, sickly gray, and his hands were trembling uncontrollably as he clutched a thick leather briefcase tightly to his chest. They looked exactly like two arrogant people who had just watched their entire universe catch fire. My father paced aggressively across my living room rug, demanding my immediate attention. He completely ignored the fact that less than a week ago he had screamed at me and kicked me out of his pristine dining room. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes and began spinning the most ridiculous, delusional lie I had ever heard in my entire life. He told me there had been a catastrophic banking error at the highest corporate level. He claimed a simple clerical glitch in the global routing system had temporarily frozen all of Preston's corporate and personal domestic accounts. Vernon waved his hands frantically, insisting it was all just a massive, unprecedented misunderstanding with the Federal Reserve. He said the bank's legal team was working around the clock to clear the ridiculous freeze, but it was severely holding up Preston's monumental commercial real estate development. He tried to convince me that the billionaire investors were getting restless, and that Preston just needed a temporary cash injection to keep the developers happy until the bank fixed their foolish administrative mistake. Darlene stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us. She reached out and grabbed my arm with desperate, clutching fingers. Her manicured nails dug sharply into my skin through the fabric of my cotton sweater. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, and told me I needed to co-sign a bridge loan for Preston immediately. She said they desperately needed my pristine credit score because their own accounts were entirely tied up in the frozen corporate assets. They had already tried to secure the high-interest commercial loan themselves, but the automated underwriting systems had immediately flagged the massive security freeze on their joint accounts. My mother demanded that I put my good name on the line for Preston. She told me it was my absolute duty as a loyal daughter and a supportive sister to step up when the family was facing a temporary financial hurdle. She tried to aggressively guilt-trip me, telling me that true family always makes deep sacrifices for each other when things get tough. I looked down at my mother's shaking hands, grabbing my clothes, and I felt a wave of absolute sickening disgust wash over my entire body. I ripped my arm away from her tight grip and took a deliberate step back, creating a cold boundary between us. I stared directly into her desperate, panicked eyes and asked her how she could possibly dare to stand in my home and talk to me about family sacrifices. I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any warmth as I dragged them back 10 years into the past. I reminded them of a freezing rainy afternoon during my sophomore year of college when I sat crying at their expensive kitchen table. I was facing immediate academic expulsion because I was short exactly $5,000 for my spring tuition and expensive mandatory textbooks. I had begged them on my hands and knees to simply co-sign a basic student loan for me. They had looked me dead in the eye and flatly refused to lift a single finger. They told me I was acting entitled and that I desperately needed to learn the hard, crushing reality of adult financial responsibility. I reminded them how I spent the next 2 entire years working grueling, exhausting overnight shifts at a greasy 24-hour highway diner just to keep myself enrolled in my accounting classes. I worked until my feet physically bled, smelling like stale burnt coffee and cheap deep-fried food every single day of my life. I dragged my exhausted, heavy body to early morning finance lectures on zero sleep fighting tooth and nail just to survive while they sat in their luxury home praising my sister. I reminded them that during that exact same semester, they had happily purchased Chantel a brand new luxury sedan simply because she managed to pass her basic undergraduate classes with incredibly mediocre grades. They used to wrinkle their noses when I came home to visit, complaining that my uniform smelled like cheap grease and telling their wealthy friends that my struggling was building my character. They had never sacrificed a single thing for me in my entire life, and their absolute audacity to demand I ruin my pristine financial standing for a criminal was deeply laughable. I looked at Vernon and told him with absolute chilling certainty that I would never under any circumstances attach my name to Preston's rapidly sinking ship. I told them their golden son-in-law was not a helpless victim of a clerical banking error, but a desperate, transparent fraud who was drowning in his own pathetic lies. My father turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged visibly as he lost whatever tiny shred of forced composure he had left. He stepped aggressively toward me, pointing a shaking, rigid finger right in my face. He screamed that I was a vindictive, useless child who was completely blind to real visionary success. He yelled that they did not need my pathetic credit score or my ungrateful, horrible help anyway. Vernon proudly shouted that Preston was a true financial genius who already had a brilliant backup plan in motion to save the development. My father roared that Preston was bypassing the frozen banks completely and selling Big Mama's land tomorrow morning to a private buyer for pure untraceable cash. The silence that followed my father's unhinged declaration was heavy and suffocating. Vernon stood in the center of my living room chest, heaving from the exertion of his own screaming. He truly believed he had just delivered the ultimate winning blow. He thought telling me that Preston was selling our grandmother's legacy to a private buyer for pure, untraceable cash was a victory. He expected me to crumble to beg or to show some sign of defeat. Instead, I felt a terrifying sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. The final puzzle piece had just locked into place, and my father had willingly handed it to me. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. They were standing in my home, aggressively defending a man who was actively destroying their lives. I took a slow breath and decided to give them one final warning. It was not out of love or daughterly duty, but simply to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, they could never say I did not try to stop them. "You cannot let Preston sell that land," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper that commanded the quiet room. Preston did not legally acquire Big Mama's property, Vernon. He forged my signature on the deed transfer. He faked the notary stamp and used it as collateral for a highly illegal loan from a shadow lender. He is not dealing with a simple banking error. He is actively committing aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. If he goes through with a cash sale tomorrow morning, he will be compounding his crimes. And if you help him facilitate this transaction, you will be acting as accessories to a federal offense. The FBI will not care that you thought he was a tech genius. They will seize everything you own and they will put you in federal prison right alongside him. I watched the words hit them, but the truth simply bounced off their impenetrable armor of denial. They were in far too deep to turn back now. Admitting that I was right meant admitting that their entire lives were a lie. It meant acknowledging that their golden white son-in-law was a parasite and that their massive retirement fund was already gone. Their fragile egos simply could not process that level of absolute failure. Darlene stepped forward, her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. Her eyes were wide and wild, completely devoid of any maternal warmth. She looked at me not as a daughter, but as an enemy who was standing between her and the illusion of elite wealth. "You are a sick, jealous liar," my mother hissed, her voice trembling with absolute venom. "You cannot stand the fact that your sister married a successful man who actually takes care of us. You have spent your entire life trying to tear down everything beautiful in this family because you are so bitter and completely useless." And then she did it. My own mother leaned forward and deliberately spat right in my face. The warm moisture hit my cheek and slowly slid down my skin. Julian moved instantly, his large frame stepping forward to protect me, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But I held up a single hand, stopping him in his tracks. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hand to wipe my face. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. The physical assault did not hurt me. Instead, it severed the very last invisible thread of guilt I had been carrying. Any lingering sense of duty or obligation I felt toward the woman who gave birth to me vanished completely in that single vile action. I looked at her with absolute zero emotion. My face was a stone mask reflecting the total emptiness I felt inside. "You are no longer my daughter," Darlene spat, stepping back and clutching Vernon's arm as if I were a disease. "We are officially done with you. Preston is the true son of this family. He respects us and he provides for us. He is 10 times the person you will ever be, and we do not need your pathetic help or your disgusting lies. We are going to celebrate his massive real estate sale tomorrow, and we are going to enjoy the incredible wealth he is building for us. Do not ever try to contact us again." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic disownment echo through the quiet foyer. They had spent my entire childhood making me feel like a burden. They had refused to help me pay for college textbooks, forcing me to work grueling night shifts at a greasy diner just to survive. They had mocked my career and belittled my marriage to Julian. Now they were officially throwing me away for a con artist who was actively robbing them blind. Remember this exact moment, I told them, my voice ringing with a chilling, permanent finality. Remember that I stood in this room and told you the absolute truth. Remember that I offered you a chance to walk away, and remember that you chose him over me. Vernon scoffed loudly, grabbing my mother's arm and pulling her toward the front door. "We will gladly remember the day we finally cut off the dead weight in this family," he threw back over his shoulder. They turned and walked out of my house, the heavy front door slamming shut behind them with a violent echoing thud. Through the large living room window, I watched my father angrily start the engine of his luxury sedan. They reversed out of my driveway with aggressive speed, the tires squealing against the dark asphalt as they drove away into the night, completely blind to the catastrophic reality of their situation. Julian walked over to me quietly, handing me a soft linen towel to wipe my cheek. He did not offer empty apologies or try to comfort me with useless words. He knew exactly what I needed. He reached over to the desk and picked up my encrypted work tablet, tapping the screen a few times before handing it to me. "They are entirely beyond saving," Julian murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. "But you already knew that. Look at the incoming secure message from your acquisitions team." I wiped my face and looked down at the glowing digital screen. My lead director, Mark, had just forwarded the final purchase agreement and the buyer profile for the emergency cash sale of Big Mama's land. Preston had been frantically searching the private markets all weekend, looking for a discreet buyer to liquidate the stolen property before his frozen corporate accounts brought his entire scheme crashing down around him. He was desperate for untraceable funds to flee the country, and he thought he had successfully found a greedy real estate developer willing to overlook the legal red flags and pay pure cash under the table by tomorrow morning. I stared at the heavily encrypted digital contract, watching the progress bar confirm the final meeting location. My lips curled into a slow, dangerous smile as I read the terms of the agreement. Preston was absolutely right about one thing. He was indeed meeting a private buyer at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to sign over the stolen deed. But what my arrogant, desperate brother-in-law and my foolish parents did not realize was the true identity of the purchaser. The incredibly wealthy private buyer who was going to hand him a briefcase full of cash was actually a secure, highly layered shell company. It was an anonymous corporate entity that had been set up exclusively by my private equity firm. It belonged entirely to me. I was going to be the one sitting across the table when the absolute destruction of his life finally commenced. The sun rose over the city, casting a harsh, bright light against the sleek glass windows of Preston's downtown corporate office. I sat alone at my kitchen island, cradling a mug of black coffee while staring intently at my glowing laptop screen. My lead acquisitions director, David, had established a secure live audio feed from his laptop inside Preston's conference room. I was not going to miss a single second of this. I had spent weeks meticulously setting this trap, and now I was going to listen to the exact moment my brother-in-law's entire life completely unraveled. Preston walked into his office suite at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. I could hear the smug, heavy thud of his expensive leather shoes echoing clearly through the microphone. He was undoubtedly wearing one of his custom-tailored Italian suits, projecting the image of a fearless, self-made titan of industry. He fully expected to walk out of that room with a briefcase full of clean, untraceable cash. He genuinely thought he was meeting a desperate private real estate developer who was eager to buy Big Mama's land, no questions asked. He pushed open the heavy glass doors of his private conference room, completely ready to close the most important fraudulent deal of his pathetic life. "Good morning, Preston," a cold, clinical voice echoed over the audio feed. It was David, sitting perfectly still at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by 3 other senior forensic auditors from my firm. They were not smiling, and they were not wearing flashy watches or expensive designer ties. They were the grim reapers of the corporate financial world, and they had finally come to collect their due. I heard Preston let out a confused, arrogant laugh. He demanded to know who the hell they were and what they were doing in his private suite. His voice was dripping with that immediate privileged condescension he always used to intimidate my father and control my sister. He told them he was supposed to be signing a private property transfer this morning and did not have time for random unscheduled meetings. He aggressively warned them that unless they were there to hand him a certified cashier's check, they needed to pack up their cheap little briefcases and get out of his office before he called building security to have them physically removed. David did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He simply slid a massive bound folder across the polished table. The heavy thud of the paper landing in front of Preston was a beautiful sound. "There is no private buyer, Preston," David stated, his tone completely flat and unyielding. The shell company you thought you were selling stolen property to this morning is a fully owned subsidiary of our private equity firm. We are here to conduct a mandatory immediate audit on all of your corporate holdings, your personal accounts, and every single offshore shell entity you control. Preston slammed his hand down on the table so hard the sound made my laptop speakers crackle. He spat out his words, asking if they had any idea who they were talking to. His voice rose into that familiar aggressive pitch he always used when he felt cornered. He proudly declared that he was a senior venture capitalist managing a billion-dollar portfolio. He insisted they could not just walk into a white-collar corporate suite and demand an audit without a federal warrant. He threatened to call his high-powered legal team right that very second, and personally ensure that every single one of them was sued into absolute bankruptcy for corporate espionage and trespassing. He yelled that they were completely out of their depth, thinking they could march in and bully a successful white man in his own corporate building. "Call your lawyers," Preston David replied smoothly without a hint of hesitation. "In fact, you should probably put them on speakerphone right now so they can explain to you exactly how much federal prison time you are currently facing." I heard the rustle of paper as David opened the heavy folder. "We have the digital audit trail of your entire operation, Preston. We have the original forged deed transfer for the residential property you stole from Vernon and Darlene Wilson. We have the exact routing numbers you used last night to illegally drain $500,000 from their personal retirement accounts. And most importantly, we have a complete forensic breakdown of your proprietary trading algorithm." I listened closely as Preston's heavy, angry breathing suddenly stopped entirely. The silence in the conference room became absolute and suffocating. "You really thought your coding was genius?" David continued, relentlessly dissecting Preston's entire ego piece by piece. "You thought bouncing the stolen funds through a dozen different offshore shell companies and masking the transfers as mezzanine debt would make you invisible to the regulatory agencies. But you are not a genius, Preston. You are just a common thief who left a digital footprint a mile wide. We tracked every single fake transaction down to the exact cent. You do not own $1 billion portfolio. You own $40 million in highly illegal fraudulent debt. And as of yesterday morning, our firm owns every single one of those contracts. Your bank accounts are permanently frozen. Your assets are legally seized. Your early investors are currently being notified by federal authorities, and your fake empire is officially over." There was a long, agonizing silence. I could almost see the color completely draining from Preston's face as the crushing reality of his situation finally pierced through his massive shield of arrogance. He was looking at irrefutable mathematical proof of his own crimes. The papers sitting right in front of him detailed exactly how he had ruined his own life and completely destroyed my parents' financial future. He tried to speak to offer some sort of defense or explanation, but only a pathetic choking sound came out of his throat. His arrogant charm and his racial privilege meant absolutely nothing against a team of seasoned auditors who held the undeniable math of his total destruction in their hands. I heard the harsh scrape of a heavy chair being pushed back violently. Preston stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. He did not attempt to say another word to defend his honor. He simply turned around and fled from the conference room, leaving the heavy glass door swinging wildly on its metal hinges. I smiled softly as I reached out and closed my laptop screen, letting the sweet taste of absolute victory settle warmly in my chest. Preston was a cornered, desperate animal now, and I knew exactly what a coward like him would do next. Miles away inside the corporate suite, Preston sprinted down the long hallway and lunged into his private office. He slammed the heavy wooden door shut and threw the deadbolt, locking himself inside. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely grip the edges of his desk. He collapsed onto the carpeted floor, completely unable to catch his breath, as the walls of his beautiful corner office literally felt like they were shrinking to crush him. He fumbled desperately in his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, dialing his wife's number, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Chantel picked up on the second ring, her voice still incredibly tight and angry from her humiliating ordeal at the luxury boutique the previous afternoon. Preston did not give her a chance to complain about her frozen credit cards or whine about my supposed jealousy. Chantel, you need to listen to me very carefully. He wheezed, his voice completely stripped of its usual smooth confidence and reduced to a pathetic, terrified whimper. Do not pack anything heavy. Just grab your jewelry, whatever loose cash is left in the hidden wall safe, and your passport. You need to get out the back door of the house right now. The feds are coming, Chantel. The money is entirely gone, and we have to flee the country tonight. The clock on my office wall glowed a pale blue, indicating it was just past 11 at night. I was sitting in the dark watching a secure encrypted feed that my federal contacts had graciously provided. The grainy black and white security footage showed the international departure terminal at the local airport. Preston and Chantel were practically running toward the first-class check-in counter, looking like two terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship. Preston was sweating profusely, his expensive custom suit completely rumpled and his tie missing. Chantel was struggling to drag two massive, oversized designer suitcases that were undoubtedly stuffed with whatever jewelry and loose cash she had managed to scrape together from their hidden wall safe. They were trying to catch a red-eye flight to Mexico, a desperate, pathetic attempt to cross the border before the federal warrants could officially process through the system. They pushed their way to the front of the line, ignoring the angry glares of other passengers. I watched Preston slam their passports onto the counter, his hands visibly shaking as he demanded the ticket. Agent, print their boarding passes immediately. The agent swiped his heavy navy blue passport through the scanner. I leaned forward in my chair, waiting for the beautiful, inevitable digital block to register. The system immediately flagged his identity. A bright red error message flashed on the agent's screen. Preston was officially on the federal no-fly list. Two armed Transportation Security Administration agents immediately stepped out from behind the counter, approaching Preston with their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. They calmly informed him that his passport had been flagged by the federal government and that he was legally prohibited from leaving the country. The sheer panic that exploded across Preston's face was absolute poetry. He stumbled backward, bumping into Chantel, who immediately launched into a shrill, hysterical tantrum. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, pointing a perfectly manicured finger right in the faces of the federal security agents. She demanded to know if they had any idea who her husband was. She shrieked that they were extremely wealthy elites who were simply trying to take a spontaneous luxury vacation to Cabo, and that they were being illegally harassed. She played the ultimate helpless victim, crying loudly and accusing the agents of targeting them out of pure jealousy. Her pathetic performance echoed loudly through the entire international terminal, drawing a massive crowd of onlookers who quickly pulled out their phones to record her humiliating meltdown. Just as the security agents were preparing to physically restrain Chantel, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb outside the terminal doors. My parents, Vernon and Darlene, rushed into the airport looking completely frantic and out of breath. My father was clutching a heavy canvas duffel bag to his chest. They had driven straight to the airport the moment Preston called them, begging for emergency cash because all of his accounts were completely frozen. They were perfectly willing to drain their last remaining liquid assets just to help a federal criminal escape justice. Vernon pushed his way through the crowd of spectators, his face red with exertion as he reached the security checkpoint. He saw Preston being detained by the agents and immediately went into his usual arrogant damage control mode. My father actually opened the canvas duffel bag, revealing thick stacks of emergency cash. He leaned in close to the lead security officer and tried to quietly bribe a federal agent in the middle of a crowded international airport. He told the officer that there was $10,000 in the bag if they would simply look the other way and let his brilliant son-in-law board the plane. It was a stunning, sickening display of enabling behavior. They were actively trying to facilitate a federal crime just to protect their precious illusion of high society wealth. The security officer looked at my father with absolute disgust and warned him that offering a cash bribe to a federal employee was a felony offense. Darlene started sobbing loudly, grabbing Vernon's arm and begging the agents to show some mercy to their family. It was a pathetic, chaotic mess of screaming, crying, and arrogant entitlement. They were completely blinded by their own delusion, completely unable to comprehend that their fake empire had already collapsed around them. As the tension in the terminal reached a breaking point, the crowd suddenly parted to make way for two tall men in dark, immaculate suits. They did not look like local security or airport police. They moved with a cold, calculated authority that immediately silenced Chantel's hysterical screaming. They were special agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they had been tracking Preston's movements since the moment he tried to wire the stolen money offshore. The lead FBI agent stepped right up to Preston, who was now trembling so violently he looked like he might collapse onto the polished tile floor. My parents immediately backed away, their arrogant confidence instantly evaporating at the sight of actual federal authority. The agent did not pull out handcuffs. He did not read Preston his Miranda rights or force him to the ground. Instead, he simply reached inside his dark suit jacket and pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope. He handed the heavy envelope directly to Preston, pressing it firmly against his chest. The agent spoke in a low voice that was clearly captured by the ambient security microphones. He informed Preston that he was not under physical arrest at this exact moment because a much larger corporate entity had requested a temporary hold on his custody transfer. The agent told him that the envelope contained a mandatory legal summons for an emergency shareholder meeting with his primary corporate creditor. He clearly stated that the meeting was scheduled for exactly 9 o'clock the following morning. The FBI agent looked Preston dead in the eye and delivered a chilling final ultimatum. He told him that if he did not walk into that specific boardroom tomorrow morning and face his primary creditor, he would be immediately tracked down, arrested, and thrown straight into a federal holding cell without any possibility of bail. The agents then turned and walked away, leaving Preston holding the heavy summons in his shaking hands while my parents stared at him in pure, unadulterated terror. I sat back in my dark office watching the live feed as Preston slowly tore open the manila envelope. His hands were completely unsteady as he pulled out the formal legal summons. I knew exactly what was printed on that crisp white paper. It was a mandatory order to appear at the corporate headquarters of the massive shadow entity that now owned every single piece of his fraudulent debt. He was ordered to face the ruthless private buyer who had officially purchased his completely fake financial portfolio. As my parents dragged a hyperventilating Chantel away from the security checkpoint and guided a completely paralyzed Preston back toward their waiting town car, I looked down at the physical copy of the buyer's contract sitting on my desk. Preston thought he was going to beg a faceless corporate board for mercy tomorrow morning. He had absolutely no idea that the incredibly wealthy anonymous private buyer he was supposed to meet, the primary creditor who now held his entire pathetic life in the palm of their hand, was actually my own highly secured shell company. Tomorrow morning, Preston was going to walk into a boardroom expecting to face a team of strange corporate sharks. But the only person sitting at the head of that long mahogany table was going to be me. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast that seemed to swallow the city whole. The towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed my private equity firm pierced through the low clouds, looking like a massive, imposing fortress of absolute corporate power. It was located in the most expensive and exclusive financial district downtown, a place where casual wealth meant absolutely nothing, and institutional power ruled everything. I sat in my private office watching the live security feed from the ground floor lobby as Preston, Chantel, and my parents walked through the heavy revolving doors. They had been forced to leave their impounded luxury vehicles behind and arrive in a standard rideshare, which clearly set the tone for their miserable morning. Despite the fact that Preston was essentially walking to his own financial execution, he was still desperately trying to project an aura of arrogant authority. He wore a brand new tailored suit, but his face was incredibly pale and hollow, looking like a man who had not slept a single second. Chantel was clutching a designer handbag to her chest like a protective shield, hiding behind massive dark sunglasses even though they were indoors. My parents flanked them like loyal bodyguards, completely oblivious to the fact that they were walking straight into a meticulously designed trap. Vernon marched up to the pristine marble security desk with his chest puffed out, attempting to intimidate the highly trained corporate security personnel. I watched through the high-definition cameras as my father loudly proclaimed that his son-in-law was a senior venture capitalist who was being subjected to illegal corporate harassment. He slapped his hand against the marble counter, demanding to be escorted to the primary creditor's boardroom immediately and threatening to sue the entire building management for emotional distress and unlawful detainment. The security guards did not flinch or offer a single apology. They simply scanned Preston's federal summons and printed 4 temporary visitor badges, handing them over with cold professional indifference. They directed the panicked group toward the private executive elevators that led directly to the top floor of the skyscraper. My mother Darlene loudly scoffed at the guards adjusting her expensive silk scarf and muttering about the unacceptable lack of respect for elite clients. The silent high-speed elevator carried them up 60 floors in a matter of seconds, trapping them in a small metal box with their own mounting terror. When the heavy doors finally slid open, they stepped out into the sprawling executive reception area. The entire floor was designed to be deeply intimidating, featuring dark mahogany-paneled walls, imported black marble floors, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the city far below. My executive assistant politely greeted them and led them down a long, quiet corridor toward the primary boardroom. There were no other employees visible, giving the entire floor an eerie, isolating atmosphere. They were ushered into a massive conference room, dominated by a custom-built 30-foot-long solid oak table surrounded by 24 heavy leather chairs. The room was completely empty, perfectly silent, and bathed in the cold gray light filtering through the massive windows. They took their seats near the middle of the long table, huddling together like frightened animals seeking safety in numbers. Chantel immediately pulled off her sunglasses, revealing red, puffy eyes and a face completely rigid with fear. She grabbed Preston's arm tightly, her manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. She whispered frantically, asking him what they were going to do and begging him to fix this before they all ended up in federal prison. Preston quickly leaned in and tried to shush her, his eyes darting nervously around the empty boardroom. He puffed out his chest and forced a patronizing smirk onto his face, trying desperately to maintain the illusion of control. He told Chantel to calm down and stop acting so hysterical. He confidently promised her that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He claimed that the people running this private equity firm were just stupid corporate suits who only understood basic spreadsheets and outdated banking models. He boasted that he was going to walk circles around them by using complex tech jargon and advanced algorithmic buzzwords to completely confuse their compliance officers. He promised my parents that by the time he was done talking, these foolish investors would be begging him to manage their portfolios instead of calling in his debts. Vernon nodded along eagerly, swallowing every single drop of Preston's ridiculous delusional lies. My father leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms and loudly declaring that this whole meeting was just a pathetic intimidation tactic used by jealous inferior businessmen. He puffed out his chest and proudly proclaimed that Preston was going to sue whoever was doing this for every single cent they were worth. Darlene reached across the table and patted Preston's hand, offering him her blind, unconditional support. She told him he was the smartest man in the room and that he was going to easily outsmart whatever pathetic little accountants dared to question his brilliant financial strategies. They sat there feeding off each other's arrogant energy, completely convincing themselves that they were untouchable elites who were simply humoring a minor administrative inconvenience. They were so entirely wrapped up in their own toxic vanity that they did not even bother to look toward the front of the room, where the massive, oversized chair reserved exclusively for the chief executive officer sat empty, waiting for its rightful owner to arrive. I stood in the private hallway just outside the boardroom doors, with Julian standing tall and silent right beside me. We had listened to their entire pathetic conversation through the internal audio feed, and the sheer delusion of their arrogance only made what was about to happen infinitely more satisfying. I smoothed the front of my tailored charcoal business suit and took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold, clinical focus of a senior forensic auditor completely take over my mind. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handles of the double oak doors. I pushed them open simultaneously, causing them to swing wide and hit the wall. Stops with a loud, resonant thud that echoed like a gunshot through the silent conference room. The sudden noise caused all four of them to jump violently in their seats. The conversation instantly died, plunging the massive room into a state of absolute dead silence. Preston, Chantel, Vernon, and Darlene all whipped their heads toward the entrance, their faces freezing in a collective mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Julian and I walked into the boardroom, our footsteps echoing sharply against the polished marble floor with a slow, deliberate cadence. I did not look at my parents. I did not spare a single glance for my sister, who was now gripping the edge of the oak table so hard her knuckles were turning stark white. My eyes were locked dead on Preston, watching the color completely drain from his face as his arrogant smirk dissolved into an expression of absolute profound terror. I walked smoothly past all of their terrified faces, moving directly to the head of the massive table. I pulled back the heavy leather chief executive chair and calmly took my seat right in front of them, watching their entire world finally and permanently collapse. The silence in the room stretched on for several agonizing seconds. The air felt incredibly heavy and thick with the sudden crushing realization of what my presence actually meant. Preston sat frozen in his chair, his mouth slightly open as his eyes darted from my face to the luxurious surroundings of the chief executive office. He was desperately trying to make his brain process the impossible reality that the quiet, boring accountant he had mocked and belittled for years was actually the ruthless corporate entity that had just completely swallowed his entire fraudulent empire. Chantel looked like she was struggling to breathe, her chest heaving as she stared at Julian, who stood behind my chair like a quiet, immovable wall of absolute support. Vernon and Darlene simply stared at me in mute horror, their previous arrogant boasting completely vaporized by the sheer magnitude of their own monumental miscalculation. They had walked into this skyscraper, expecting to bully a faceless creditor into submission. But instead, they were forced to look directly at the daughter they had thrown away. I placed my hands flat on the polished oak table and let a slow, icy smile touch my lips, perfectly ready to deliver the final killing blow. The heavy silence was immediately shattered by the shrill sound of my mother's voice. Darlene leapt to her feet, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and absolute rage. "Maya, what in the world are you doing in here?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Get out of that chair right this second. You have absolutely no right to be in this building, let alone sitting at the head of a corporate boardroom." She slammed her hands on the table, demanding that Julian and I leave before the real creditors arrived. She screamed that I was deliberately trying to sabotage my sister, and that my petty, childish jealousy was going to embarrass the entire family in front of prestigious businessmen. She looked wildly toward the oak doors, apologizing to the empty air, promising whoever might be listening that she would have her delusional, useless daughter removed by security immediately. Her voice echoed off the wood paneling, a desperate, frantic sound of a woman desperately clinging to a reality that no longer existed. Preston leaned back in his leather chair and let out a loud, booming laugh. The sound echoed off the dark walls, filled with his usual arrogant condescension. He actually clapped his hands together as if he were watching a pathetic comedy routine. "Very funny, Maya. he sneered, shaking his head. You almost had us for a second. Did you bribe a security guard to let you sneak up here just to play a stupid prank? Listen, sweetie, the adults have a very important multi-million-dollar restructuring meeting in about 2 minutes, so you and your husband need to pack up your little game and run along before I have you both arrested for trespassing. I did not move a single muscle. I just kept my eyes locked directly on his, watching the fake bravado drip from his pores. I let him enjoy his last 5 seconds of false superiority. My corporate attorney, David, who had been quietly sitting in the corner of the room, stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked to my side, standing just behind my right shoulder. He did not shout or raise his voice, but his cold, authoritative tone instantly silenced my mother's frantic screaming and Preston's pathetic laughter. Please show some respect to Mrs. Maya, David said smoothly, his words cutting through the air like a razor blade. She is not playing a prank, Mr. Preston. She is the founder and managing partner of this private equity firm. She is the anonymous buyer who purchased your offshore assets yesterday morning, and she currently owns 100% of the $4 million debt that you defaulted on. The words hung in the empty air, slowly sinking into their thick skulls. I watched the exact second the catastrophic reality finally broke through Preston's impenetrable wall of arrogance. His smug, condescending smile completely vanished, melting into an expression of raw, unfiltered horror. His eyes widened so far, they looked like they were going to pop out of his skull, and his jaw literally dropped open. He stared at me, as if I had just morphed into a ghost. The man who had spent the last 10 years belittling my intelligence, mocking my career, and draining my parents' bank accounts was suddenly looking at the absolute undeniable architect of his total ruin. Chantel let out a strange, choking gasp. She physically slumped down in her heavy leather chair, as if all the bones in her body had suddenly turned to liquid. Her expensive designer handbag slid off her lap and crashed onto the marble floor, spilling her makeup and keys everywhere. But she did not even flinch. She just kept staring at me, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently against the edge of the table. The devastating realization was washing over her in real time. The woman sitting across from her, holding the power to send her husband to federal prison and seize every single luxury item she had ever owned, was not a stranger. It was her very own sister. The ugly dropout sister she had relentlessly mocked. The worthless outcast they had all happily thrown away. Now she literally owned them. Vernon collapsed back into his seat, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. He looked from David to Julian, and then finally to me, his mind entirely unable to process the fact that the daughter he had called a complete failure was the chief executive sitting on the throne of a massive corporate empire. My mother was completely paralyzed, her hands still hovering in the air where she had been pointing at me just moments before. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. There is no way, Preston whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. This is a lie. This is illegal. You cannot possibly own this firm. You do not have that kind of capital. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished oak table, and folded my hands together. I have spent the last 7 years building an international asset management firm. From the ground up, I replied, my voice calm and deadly quiet. While you were busy stealing from your own family and faking financial reports to fund Chantel's shopping sprees, I was quietly acquiring distressed properties and turning them into highly profitable portfolios. I built my wealth in the shadows, far away from your pathetic need for social validation. And when I realized exactly what you were doing to Big Mama's land, I decided it was time to step out of the dark. You see, Preston? I continued, watching the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. You thought you were running a brilliant scam because you only target people who trust you. You preyed on my parents' desperate need to look wealthy. You used my sister's endless greed to blind her to the reality of your crimes. But you made one fatal miscalculation. You assumed that because I walked away from this toxic family, I was weak. You assumed I was just a powerless victim who would quietly watch you steal the only piece of genuine legacy my grandmother left behind. I slowly slid a thick stack of legal documents across the table. The heavy thud of the paper stopping right at the edge of his fingertips made him flinch. Those are the transfer deeds, the asset seizure notices, and the criminal referral forms, Preston, I said softly. You do not own a house anymore. You do not own a car. Your bank accounts belong to me. Your offshore funds belong to me. Every single thing you thought you stole is officially my property. You are going to sit in that chair and you are going to sign every single one of these pages confessing to your fraudulent activities, or I will have David hand this entire file over to the federal agents waiting in the lobby right now. The silence returned heavy and absolute. Preston looked down at the documents, his hands shaking so violently he could not even pick up the pen resting beside them. Chantel began to quietly sob, her face buried in her hands as the finality of their destruction settled over the room. My parents remained completely mute, entirely unable to comprehend the monumental shift in power. The golden son-in-law they had worshipped was reduced to a trembling criminal, and the daughter they had discarded was the only one holding the keys to their survival. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream or bang my fists on the table like they had just done minutes before. True power is completely silent. And I had all of it. I reached down into my leather briefcase, resting beside my chair, and slowly pulled out 3 thick, color-coded manila folders. I set them down on the polished oak table with a deliberate heavy thud that made everyone flinch. These are not just transfer deeds, I said, my voice perfectly level and brutally calm. These are the exact blueprints of your complete and utter destruction, Preston. I slid the first folder forward, tapping the heavy cardstock with my index finger. Open it, I commanded. Preston's hands were trembling so violently he could barely grasp the edge of the folder. When he finally flipped the cover open, the blood completely drained from his already pale face. Inside was a stack of highly magnified forensic documents. This is the deed to Big Mama's house, I explained, watching his eyes dart frantically across the pages. You thought you were so incredibly clever when you forged my signature to transfer the property into your offshore holding company. You assumed the notary public you bribed would keep their mouth shut. What you did not realize is that the notary got scared when federal agents started asking questions about your shadow lender last month. They flipped on you, Preston. They handed over the original unedited documents proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that you committed aggravated identity theft and federal wire fraud. You did not just steal land, you committed a federal crime that carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. My father let out a strangled gasp. He tried to speak to defend his beloved son-in-law, but his voice completely failed him. Preston did not even look at Vernon. He was staring at the folder like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. I did not give him a single second to recover. I immediately slid the second folder across the table, pushing it right next to the first one. I looked directly at my parents, watching the arrogant denial slowly melt away into pure, unadulterated panic. You might want to look at this one, Vernon, I said, keeping my tone completely devoid of any sympathy. This is a complete itemized breakdown of your personal retirement accounts. The mutual funds you spent 40 years building, the high-yield savings accounts you bragged about at every single country club dinner, and the joint checking account you shared with Darlene. Vernon reached out with a shaking hand and pulled the folder toward him. Darlene leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she looked at the bottom line of the financial statements. The numbers printed in bold red ink showed a massive string of zeros. It is all gone, I stated flatly, letting the devastating truth sink into their bones. Preston did not just mismanage your money. He actively drained every single cent you owned to cover his margin calls when his fraudulent trading algorithm collapsed last week. He treated your life savings like a personal slush fund to keep his fake empire afloat just a few days longer. You are completely bankrupt, Vernon. You do not have a single dollar left to your name. Darlene let out a high-pitched wail, clutching her chest as if she were having a physical heart attack. She turned to Preston, her face contorted with absolute shock and betrayal. Preston, tell me this is a lie, she sobbed, reaching out to grab his sleeve. Tell me you did not steal our money. We trusted you. We gave you everything. Preston kept his head down, staring blankly at the polished wood table. He did not have a single arrogant excuse left. His silence was the loudest confession they could have possibly heard. Vernon's face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. His entire body was shaking as the catastrophic reality of his situation finally broke through his impenetrable wall of denial. But I was not finished. I had saved the sharpest blade for last. I picked up the third and final folder. It was much thinner than the others, but it contained the absolute worst betrayal of all. I did not slide this one to Preston or my parents. I slid it directly across the table to Chantel. My sister was already slumped in her chair, mascara running down her cheeks, looking like a shattered porcelain doll. She stared at the folder with wide, terrified eyes, completely afraid of what else could possibly be taken from her. "Open it, Chantel," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper. She reached out with trembling fingers and flipped open the cover. Inside were copies of 2 electronic boarding passes and a detailed travel itinerary. Chantel stared at the papers, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she tried to make sense of the destinations and the dates. "You thought you were flying to Mexico together tonight to lay low until the heat died down," I said, watching her eyes scan the names on the tickets. "You packed your designer bags and grabbed your jewelry, thinking your brilliant husband had a master plan to save you both. But look closely at the connecting flights, Chantel." She picked up the paper, her hands shaking so badly the page rattled in the quiet room. I looked at Chantel. "He didn't buy 2 tickets to the Cayman, sis. He bought 1. You were just his shield. Your ticket ends in Mexico City. His ticket connects to a private charter flying to a non-extradition country in South America. And look at the passenger name on the second ticket for that charter flight. It is not yours. It belongs to his 24-year-old assistant. You are never going to live happily ever after on a beach, Chantel. He was going to abandon you in a foreign country with absolutely no money and let the federal authorities tear you apart while he started a new life with his mistress." The silence that followed those words was the most profound, terrifying quiet I had ever experienced. The air in the boardroom literally felt like it had been sucked out of the room. Chantel stared at the printed itinerary, reading the name of Preston's assistant over and over again as the ultimate betrayal finally shattered the very last piece of her delusional reality. She had thrown away her sister. She had mocked me and belittled me, all to protect a man who saw her as nothing more than a convenient decoy to buy himself time to escape. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston. The tears had completely stopped. Her face was a mask of pure, unhinged rage. Preston shrank back in his chair, raising his hands in a pathetic, defensive gesture. "Chantel, baby, listen to me," he stammered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "It is a misunderstanding. I was going to send for you." He did not even get to finish his pathetic lie. Chantel let out a primal, blood-curdling scream that echoed off the glass walls of the skyscraper. She lunged across the massive oak table with terrifying speed. She did not care about the corporate setting or the severe-looking auditors standing in the room. She launched herself directly at Preston's throat, her perfectly manicured hands turning into violent claws as she tackled him backward in his heavy leather chair. The heavy chair tipped backward and crashed onto the marble floor with a violent, sickening thud. Total physical chaos erupted in the boardroom. Preston shrieked as Chantel began tearing at his face and grabbing fistfuls of his expensive tailored suit. She was screaming incoherently, thrashing and hitting him with a lifetime of pent-up, entitled rage. David and the other auditors immediately stepped back, giving them a wide berth, refusing to interfere with the spectacular implosion of this toxic family. Vernon and Darlene were screaming in pure panic. My father tried to rush around the table to pull Chantel off the bleeding man, but he tripped over his own feet and crashed hard onto his knees. Darlene was sobbing hysterically, screaming for someone to call the police, screaming for someone to make it stop. And in the middle of all that violent, humiliating chaos, the final piece of their destruction finally dawned on my parents. Vernon looked up from the floor, his face completely drained of color as he looked at the open folder containing the details of their ruined retirement. He looked at the forged deeds and the massive mountain of fraudulent corporate debt. He suddenly remembered the desperate, frantic paperwork Preston had shoved in front of them late last night, begging them to sign it to secure his emergency bail money. "Oh my God," Vernon choked out, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Darlene, the house. We signed the house." My mother froze, her hands covering her mouth as the horrifying truth locked into place. In their blind, desperate attempt to save their precious golden boy from a minor legal inconvenience, they had signed their massive elite suburban estate over as absolute collateral to his shadow lenders. And because I now owned all of that debt, I literally owned the roof over their heads. They were entirely bankrupt. Their retirement was gone. Their golden son-in-law was a cheating federal criminal, and they were officially completely homeless. I sat perfectly still in the chief executive chair, my hands resting calmly on the table, watching the violent, beautiful wreckage unfold right in front of me. The trap had finally snapped shut, and it was absolutely flawless. Preston managed to scramble backward across the cold, imported black marble floor, desperately trying to kick Chantel away from him. His expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket was torn at the lapel, and a bright red scratch ran down the side of his neck, where her manicured nails had desperately caught his skin. The sound of his heavy breathing echoed loudly in the massive, silent boardroom. My father Vernon was still on his knees, clutching his chest and wheezing, as the horrifying reality of his complete financial ruin crushed the air right out of his lungs. My mother Darlene sat frozen in her heavy leather chair, rocking slightly back and forth with a blank, vacant stare. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, and she kept muttering about the estate and the country club, completely unable to process the fact that she was now entirely homeless and bankrupt. Chantel was sobbing violently on the floor. Her designer dress ruined, her perfect makeup smeared across her face in dark, jagged streaks as she mourned the death of her pathetic, delusional life. Preston finally managed to pull himself up using the edge of the massive, solid oak table. He stood there breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stared at the 3 color-coded folders resting innocently in front of me. I could actually see the exact moment his arrogant survival instinct kicked in. His desperate brain was frantically searching for a way out of the corner I had seamlessly painted him into. He smoothed down his ruined tie and cleared his throat, attempting to summon that familiar, patronizing authority he had used to manipulate my family for an entire decade. He took a slow, cautious step toward my end of the table, holding his hands up in a placating gesture as if he were trying to calm down an irrational child. He plastered a fake, understanding smile on his bruised face, relying on the same toxic charm that had allowed him to steal Big Mama's house. "Maya, listen to me," he said, his voice shaking but laced with that sickening white savior complex he wore like a second skin. "Maya, be reasonable, please. There is absolutely no need to destroy everything we have built here today. We are family, and family takes care of each other, right? You are clearly a very smart girl, and you have proven your point beautifully. You showed us all how capable you are. So let us just take a breath and figure this out like civilized professionals. We can make a deal, Maya. I have massive connections all over the financial district, and I know how to structure offshore assets better than anyone else in this city. We could merge our portfolios. We could be an absolute unstoppable team. You just have to give me those folders and let me walk out of this building. I will pay you back every single cent I owe the estate with interest. Just name your price, sweetie." I looked at him with an overwhelming sense of profound disgust. The sheer audacity of this man to stand in the middle of the absolute wreckage he created and try to patronize me into saving his pathetic life was staggering. I did not blink. I did not move. I did not offer him a single shred of sympathy or understanding. I just leaned back in my massive leather chief executive chair and let the cold silence stretch out until the quiet in the room became physically unbearable for him. The air felt heavy and suffocating as he waited for me to accept his ridiculous offer. Do you remember what you called me at Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago? Preston? I asked, my voice echoing off the dark mahogany walls, perfectly level and brutally calm. You sat at my grandmother's dining table, eating the food my parents paid for, and you told everyone that I was nothing but a glorified calculator. You laughed at my accounting degree and said I lacked the visionary genius required to understand real wealth. You told my parents that people like me were only good for keeping the books for important people like you. He swallowed hard, a thick bead of sweat tracing a slow path down his temple. Maya, I did not mean that, he stammered, taking another step back. It was just a joke. I held up my hand, stopping his pathetic lie right in its tracks. You were absolutely right, Preston, I said softly, leaning forward and resting my arms on the table. I am a calculator. I process variables, I analyze risk, and I balance ledgers. And over the last 6 months, I have calculated every single move you made. I tracked every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every offshore shell company you thought you hid so brilliantly behind your meaningless tech jargon. I calculated the exact moment your margin calls would fail, and I calculated exactly how much debt my parents would blindly sign over to save you. So let us look at the final equation together. You called me a glorified calculator. Well, the math says you are going to federal prison for 15 years. Just as the words left my mouth, the heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open once again. The synchronized sound of heavy tactical boots stepping onto the marble floor echoed through the silent room like a thunderclap. 4 federal agents dressed in dark suits and windbreakers, with the FBI logo clearly printed across their backs, marched into the executive suite with absolute professional authority. They were the exact same agents who had been monitoring Preston's flight manifest at the international airport, waiting patiently for my phone call to finally close the net. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from a corporate dispute to a severe criminal takedown. Julian stepped forward from his place behind my chair, his posture completely relaxed and his expression entirely unreadable as he reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out 2 heavy encrypted hard drives and calmly handed them over to the lead federal agent. Those contain the unredacted financial records, the wire transfer logs, and the complete chain of custody for the forged property deeds, Julian stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality in the large room. Everything you need for the indictment is organized by date and offshore account number. The lead agent nodded, taking the drives and stepping directly toward Preston. Preston backed away, his hands raised in surrender, his face completely drained of blood. He bumped into the edge of the long conference table, realizing there was absolutely nowhere left to run. The agents did not hesitate or offer any polite warnings. They grabbed his arms, twisting them sharply behind his back with practiced efficiency. The cold metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut around his wrists sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, cementing his absolute downfall. Chantel let out another agonizing, high-pitched scream. Watching the man she had sacrificed her entire family for, being treated like a common street criminal. She tried to reach out for him, but one of the agents sternly ordered her to stay on the ground, warning her that she was currently an unindicted co-conspirator. My mother buried her face in my father's shoulder, weeping uncontrollably, as the glorious, perfect illusion she had worshipped for 10 years was finally dragged out of the room in chains. My father just stared at the floor, a broken, ruined man who had traded his loyal daughter for a charismatic thief. I sat quietly at the head of the long oak table, watching the federal agents escort Preston to the elevators, completely untouched by the beautiful wreckage they had brought upon themselves. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the federal agents, sealing the absolute finality of Preston's demise. The loud, authoritative footsteps faded down the carpeted hallway, leaving behind a ringing, deafening silence in the massive boardroom. Preston was gone. The golden ticket, the brilliant venture capitalist, the flawless son-in-law had just been dragged out in stainless steel handcuffs like a common street thief. The illusion was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth. My mother, my father, and my sister were suddenly completely alone in a room owned by the daughter they had thrown away. I stayed perfectly still in the oversized leather chair, listening to the pathetic sounds of their panic. Vernon was still on the floor, gasping for air, his face a blotchy shade of purple, as his mind struggled to process the fact that his entire fortune, his pristine credit score, and his massive suburban estate were all completely gone. Chantel was curled into a tight ball on the marble floor, whimpering as she clutched her ruined designer dress. Darlene was staring at the empty doorway, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly, as if she were waiting for someone to yell cut and end this horrible nightmare. Then the shift happened. It was the most fascinating psychological pivot I had ever witnessed. I watched the exact second their arrogant entitlement completely evaporated and was instantly replaced by a sickening, desperate survival instinct. Darlene slowly turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed, stripped of the condescending glare she had used to look down on me for 30 years. She did not see the ugly duckling anymore. She did not see the glorified calculator. She saw a billionaire. She saw a lifeline. Maya. My mother whispered, her voice cracking as she slowly pushed herself up from her chair. Maya, sweetie, please. You have to fix this. She stumbled forward, her expensive heels clicking unevenly against the floor. Vernon looked up, his eyes tracking his wife before he too scrambled to his feet, leaning heavily against the oak table for support. They slowly moved toward my end of the room, their posture hunched and submissive. Chantel lifted her head, her mascara-stained face contorted in absolute desperation as she realized what our parents were doing. She scrambled up and followed them, stumbling toward me like a frightened child. They gathered around my chair, completely abandoning whatever shred of dignity they had left. My mother actually dropped to her knees right there on the cold black marble. The woman who had spent my entire life obsessing over appearances and social status was kneeling at my feet, her hands clasped together in a pathetic prayer. Vernon sank down right beside her, his heavy frame shaking, as he looked up at me with tears streaming down his wrinkled face. Please, Maya. My father begged, his voice thick and wet. You are rich. You own this entire firm. You have millions of dollars. You can save us. We did not know what Preston was doing. We swear to you. You can call off the debt. You can give us back the house. We are your parents, Maya. You cannot let us be homeless. You have to pay for our lawyers so we do not go to prison with him. Darlene reached out and tried to grab my hand, but Julian stepped forward and smoothly blocked her path. She pulled her hands back to her chest, sobbing violently. Maya, you are our blood, she wailed, leaning forward. We are your family. Family forgives each other. You have that massive estate now. You and Julian can just let us move in with you. We will not be any trouble. We will stay in the guest wing. You have so much space. You can save us from this. You are the only one who can save us. I looked down at the two of them, feeling absolutely nothing. There was no triumph in my heart, but there was also no pity. They were strangers to me. Strangers who had willingly sacrificed my well-being to feed their own toxic vanity. I slowly leaned forward, resting my chin on my folded hands, and looked directly into my mother's weeping eyes. Blood! I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the quiet room. You want to talk about blood, Darlene? You want to talk about family? They both nodded frantically, tears flying from their cheeks as they clung to the false hope that I was actually softening. Let me take you back exactly 4 years ago, I said, my tone turning to absolute ice. Let me remind you of a very specific night in a very sterile, brightly lit hospital hallway. Do you remember that night, Vernon? Do you remember it, Darlene? I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from a severe internal hemorrhage. I was terrified and completely alone, hooked up to monitors and praying for my own parents to walk through the door and tell me everything was going to be okay. My parents froze, their frantic sobbing suddenly catching in their throats as the memory washed over them. I called you from that hospital bed. I continued holding my father's terrified gaze. I begged you to come. But Preston had just closed his first fake tech merger, and he was throwing a lavish celebration dinner at the country club. You came to the hospital in your formal wear, reeking of expensive champagne. You stood in the hallway right outside my door. You did not even come into the room. I heard every single word you said to the nurses. You told them I was just being dramatic. You told them I was faking a medical emergency just to steal attention away from Preston's big night. Darlene swallowed hard, looking down at the floor as a fresh wave of tears spilled over her cheeks. Maya, we did not know it was serious, she whispered weakly. You knew, I stated, cutting off her pathetic excuse. The doctor told you exactly how close I came to dying that night. And when I finally dragged myself out of that bed and walked into the hallway to ask you why you were leaving, you looked me dead in the eyes, and you made your choice. You told me that I was a jealous, toxic burden. You told me that Preston was the son you always wanted, and that I was nothing but a failure who tried to ruin his success. You stood in that hospital hallway, and you explicitly told me I was no longer your daughter. You told me you chose him. The absolute truth of my words hung over them like a heavy, suffocating blanket. There was no gaslighting their way out of this. They could not rewrite history when the consequences of their actions were currently destroying their entire world. You made your choice 4 years ago, I said, leaning back in my chair. And now you get to live with it. You chose a fraud and a criminal over your own flesh and blood. You sold your souls for country club memberships and leased luxury cars. You do not get to claim family now just because your golden boy turned out to be a federal thief who bankrupted you. Chantel suddenly pushed her way past our parents. She dropped to the floor right next to my chair, her hair a tangled mess, her expensive jewelry clinking against the marble. She reached out and desperately grabbed my leg, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of my tailored suit trousers. "Maya, please," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Forget about them, just help me. Preston ruined my life. He was going to leave me in Mexico, Maya. He was going to leave me with nothing. You have to give me a loan. Just $1 million, Maya, please. Just enough so I can get a luxury apartment and a good divorce lawyer. I am your sister. You cannot leave me like this. I will be a laughingstock. My friends will completely abandon me. Please, Maya, give me a loan. I will do whatever you want." She sobbed uncontrollably, burying her face against my knee, clinging to me like a drowning rat. Her absolute lack of self-awareness was breathtaking. She had just found out her husband was fleeing the country with his mistress and leaving her to face federal investigators, and her first instinct was to beg her estranged sister for $1 million to maintain her fake socialite lifestyle. I looked down at her, completely disgusted by the pathetic display. I did not kick her away or pull my leg back. I just turned my head and gave a slight, deliberate nod to Julian, who was standing by the boardroom doors. Julian immediately raised his hand and signaled the private security team waiting in the executive reception area. 4 massive men in sharp, dark suits stepped through the doors, their faces completely expressionless as they marched toward the head of the table, ready to clear the trash out of my building. The 4 massive security guards moved with terrifying efficiency. They stepped directly into the chaos, pulling Chantel's clawing hands off my trousers and lifting her effortlessly off the polished black marble floor. She thrashed and kicked, sobbing hysterically as 2 of the guards held her back by her arms. The other 2 guards formed a solid, immovable human wall between my chair and my parents, forcing Vernon and Darlene to take several stumbling steps backward. The physical barrier finally broke the spell of their desperate entitlement. They were no longer dealing with a daughter they could bully or manipulate. They were dealing with a corporate entity who had absolute control over their physical space and their entire future. I slowly stood up from the chief executive chair, smoothing the front of my tailored charcoal suit jacket with deliberate, methodical precision. The massive boardroom was ringing with Chantel's pathetic whimpers and my mother's ragged, hyperventilating breathing, but I felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical closure. I reached down to this polished oak table and picked up a single crisp sheet of heavy legal paper that had been sitting at the very bottom of my folder. I stepped around the massive leather chair and walked right up to the line of security guards. I held the paper out toward my father. His hands were shaking so violently that he could barely take it from me. His eyes darted across the bold black text at the top of the page, and I watched his chest heave as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "This is the official notice of foreclosure, Vernon," I said, my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of any sympathy. "When you blindly signed over the deed to your massive elite suburban estate to secure Preston's emergency bail money, you used the house as direct collateral against his fraudulent corporate debts. And because I now own every single one of those debts, the bank is executing an immediate foreclosure on the property." Darlene let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She lunged toward Vernon, grabbing his arm and trying to read the legal notice over his trembling shoulder. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into his suit jacket as the reality of the words burned into her brain. "Maya, you cannot do this," she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her absolute terror. "You cannot take our home. Where are we supposed to go? What will our friends at the country club think when they see moving trucks taking our things away? You have millions of dollars, Maya. You own this entire building. You can easily pay off this debt. You can buy the house back for us right now and make all of this go away. We are your parents. You owe us this much." I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was a massive disappointment simply because I did not care about expensive brands or meaningless social climbing. I looked at the man who had stood in a hospital hallway and told me I was no longer his daughter just so he could go drink champagne with a criminal. "I do not owe you a single breath," I replied, the absolute certainty of my words echoing against the dark mahogany walls. "I have more than enough capital to buy that house 10 times over. But I am not going to spend a single cent to save it. I am going to let the bank take it. I am going to let them put a foreclosure sign on that pristine green lawn, right where all of your wealthy elite neighbors can see it. You built your entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and you sacrificed your own flesh and blood to maintain it. You told me I was no longer your daughter. You told me you chose him. Now you get to experience exactly what it feels like to have absolutely nothing." I turned my back on their weeping faces and walked slowly back to my side of the table. I reached into the first manila folder and carefully extracted a very old weathered piece of heavy parchment. It was the real original deed to Big Mama's house, completely protected and entirely untouched by Preston's clumsy attempts at forgery. I ran my fingers over the faded ink and the old municipal stamps, feeling the warm, heavy history of the only woman in my family who had ever truly loved me without conditions. I opened my leather briefcase and gently slid the precious document inside, securing it perfectly in the designated compartment. My parents watched me, their eyes wide and completely desperate, finally understanding the full magnitude of what they had lost. "Big Mama did not leave this property to me because I was a glorified calculator," I said, keeping my eyes on the briefcase as I snapped the heavy brass lock shut. "She left this to me because she knew exactly who you all really were. She saw through the fancy clothes and the arrogant boasting. She knew that the second she passed away, you and Chantel would gladly hand over generations of our family history to the first smooth-talking con artist who promised you a bigger house or a newer car. Big Mama left this to me because she knew I was the only one who would not sell our history for a quick buck to impress people who hate us. She trusted me to protect our legacy from your toxic greed, and that is exactly what I have done." Chantel let out another agonizing scream, struggling violently against the security guards as she begged me for a loan, pleading for me not to walk away and leave her with nothing. Darlene fell back to her knees, sobbing into her hands, while Vernon just stood there, staring blankly at the foreclosure notice as if it were written in a foreign language. Their wailing filled the massive boardroom, a pathetic symphony of entitlement finally meeting consequence. I did not look back at them. I did not offer them a final piece of advice or a single shred of comfort. I picked up my briefcase by its heavy leather handle and turned toward the exit. My posture was perfectly straight, and my mind was brilliantly clear. I walked past the weeping remnants of my biological family, my footsteps echoing with calm, steady authority against the cold marble floor. Julian stood by the heavy double oak doors waiting for me. As I approached, he reached out and pulled the heavy brass handles, pulling the doors wide open to the sprawling, silent executive floor beyond. I stepped out of the boardroom and left them entirely behind. Exactly 1 month later, the dust had finally settled over the absolute wreckage of my biological family. The beautiful thing about numbers is that they do not care about excuses or fake tears or country club reputations. When the math finally balances, the truth is laid bare for the entire world to see. And the world was definitely watching. Preston was currently sitting in a cold concrete federal holding facility, awaiting a trial he had absolutely no chance of winning. Julian had kept a close eye on the docket. The federal prosecutors had unsealed the indictment, and the list of charges was staggering. Aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and a dozen other counts that guaranteed he would not see the outside of a prison wall for at least a decade. His assets were completely frozen. Since my parents had lost their estate trying to secure his initial emergency bail, he was now deemed a massive flight risk with no collateral to offer. The arrogant venture capitalist who used to laugh at my accounting degree was now wearing an oversized, scratchy orange jumpsuit, sleeping on a thin plastic mattress, and eating whatever slop the county provided. There were no offshore accounts coming to save him. There was no mistress flying him to a non-extradition country. He was trapped in a cage of his own brilliant design. Chantel had experienced a completely different but equally devastating kind of prison. The immediate fallout from Preston's arrest had absolutely decimated her carefully curated social media empire. The luxury brands dropped her overnight. Her sponsors canceled every single contract the minute the fraud became public knowledge. It turns out that nobody wants an influencer whose entire aesthetic was funded by stolen money and shadow lenders. With her bank accounts frozen and her designer wardrobe seized as evidence of assets bought with illicit funds, she was forced to face the real world for the very first time in her pampered life. Julian showed me a photograph a private investigator had discreetly taken just a few days ago. Chantel was standing behind the cash register of a mid-tier retail clothing store at the local mall. She was wearing a generic black polo shirt and a stiff khaki apron. The harsh fluorescent lights highlighted the dark circles under her eyes. Her perfectly manicured nails were chipped, and she was forced to plaster a fake smile on her face as she folded cheap sweaters for the exact same suburban housewives she used to ruthlessly mock at her elite luncheons. There was no safety net left for her. She had to clock in. She had to stand on her feet for 8 hours a day, and she had to learn exactly what it meant to survive on a minimum wage, while people treated her like she was completely invisible. And then there were my parents. Vernon and Darlene had fallen the furthest because they had climbed the highest on a ladder made of pure delusion. The bank had moved with ruthless efficiency to execute the foreclosure on their massive estate. They were given exactly 48 hours to pack whatever personal belongings they could fit into a rental van before the locks were changed. They now lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The walls were thin, the carpet smelled faintly of old smoke, and the roar of the nearby highway was a constant reminder of how far they had fallen. But the physical downgrade was not even the worst part for them. The true punishment was the absolute, deafening silence. The moment the scandal broke and the foreclosure became public record, their precious country club friends abandoned them entirely. The elite social circle they had sacrificed my mental health and my entire childhood to maintain had dropped them like a bad habit. No one returned Darlene's frantic phone calls. No one invited Vernon to play golf. They were complete social pariahs sitting in a tiny living room, staring at each other with nothing left but the bitter reality of their own toxic choices. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt as I thought about their miserable new lives. I was too busy building my own. I stood on the wide wraparound wooden porch of Big Mama's house, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The property was alive with purposeful energy. Scaffolding surrounded the beautiful old structure, and a team of specialized historical restoration contractors were carefully working on the exterior. The sharp, rhythmic sounds of hammers and saws echoed across the green lawn, a beautiful symphony of preservation and progress. My firm was funding the entire multi-million-dollar renovation directly. We were not knocking anything down or trying to turn it into some soulless modern monstrosity like Preston had planned. We were carefully restoring every original piece of wood, updating the foundation, and bringing the vibrant history of the property back to life. Specialized artisans were restoring the original stained glass windows, and expert carpenters were matching the exact grain of the antique cedar siding. Big Mama had poured her entire soul into this land, and I was making absolutely sure that her legacy would stand strong for another 100 years. I ran my hand along the freshly painted white wooden railing, feeling the solid, undeniable truth beneath my fingertips. Big Mama had left this to me because she knew I was the only one who would not sell our history for a quick buck to impress people who hate us. She trusted me, and I had honored that trust. The front door creaked open behind me, and I heard the familiar steady footsteps of Julian stepping out onto the porch. He walked up beside me carrying two elegant crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. His sharp suit was immaculate as always, and there was a rare, genuine smile resting on his face. The final transfer paperwork for the offshore accounts cleared this morning, he said, his voice smooth and professional as he expertly popped the cork and poured the bubbling golden liquid into the glasses. The firm is now twice as profitable as it was last quarter, and the legal team confirmed that the restructuring is completely untouchable. I took a glass from his hand, watching the morning sunlight catch the tiny rising bubbles. "Thank you, Julian," I said softly, "for everything." He raised his glass slightly. "It is a privilege to work for a true visionary, Maya." We stood there in comfortable, companionable silence, looking out over the sprawling green property that was finally safe. I took a slow sip of the champagne, letting the cool, crisp taste wash over me. The air felt completely different now. It was light and clear, entirely free of the heavy, suffocating toxicity that had choked my family for decades. I did not have to hide my intelligence anymore. I did not have to shrink myself to make room for their fragile egos. I had won. Sometimes the best revenge is not screaming. It is letting toxic people drink the poison they poured for you while you sit back and watch the math do its work. I looked out at the horizon, feeling a profound, absolute peace settle deeply into my bones. The equation was finally perfectly balanced. I had everything I ever needed, and they had exactly what they deserved. Sometimes the hardest lesson is realizing that the people who share your blood will bleed you dry if you let them. My family thought my quietness was a weakness, and they mistook my patience for submission. But true power is completely silent. You do not need to scream to win. You just have to know your worth, set absolute boundaries, and let toxic people drown in the very traps they built for you. Have you ever had to finally walk away from a toxic family member to protect your peace? Share your own story in the comments below and hit subscribe for more stories of surviving betrayal.